Chapter 16, Part 2 of The Teeth of the Tiger. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 16. Weber takes his revenge. The Prefect continued: "Let us speak of the documents, Reverend Mother. Where do they come from?" "Yesterday, Monsieur le Préfet, I found in my room a communication in which the writer proposed to send me some papers that interested Florence Levasseur." "How did any one know that she was here?" asked M. Desmalions, interrupting her. "I can't tell you. The letter simply said that the papers would be at Versailles, at the poste restante in my name, on a certain day, that is to say, this morning. I was also asked not to mention them to anybody and to hand them at 3 o'clock this afternoon to Florence Levasseur, with instructions to take them to the Prefect of Police at once. I was also requested to have a letter conveyed to Sergeant Mazeroux." "To Sergeant Mazeroux? That's odd." "That letter appeared to have to do with the same business. Now I am very fond of Florence. So I sent the letter, and this morning went to Versailles and found the papers there as stated. When I got back, Florence was out. I was not able to hand them to her until her return, at about 4 o'clock." "Where were the papers posted?" "In Paris. The postmark on the envelope was that of the Avenue Niel, which happens to be the nearest office to this." "And did not the fact of finding that letter in your room strike you as strange?" "Certainly, Monsieur le Préfet, but no stranger than all the other incidents in the matter." "Nevertheless," continued M. Desmalions, who was watching Florence's pale face, "nevertheless, when you saw that the instructions which you received came from this house and that they concerned a person living in this house, did you not entertain the idea that that person—" "The idea that Florence had entered the room, unknown to me, for such a purpose?" cried the superior. "Oh, Monsieur le Préfet, Florence is incapable of doing such a thing." The girl was silent, but her drawn features betrayed the feelings of alarm that upset her. Don Luis went up to her and said: "The mystery is clearing, Florence, isn't it? And you are suffering in consequence. Who put the letter in Mother Superior's room? You know, don't you? And you know who is conducting all this plot?" She did not answer. Then, turning to the deputy chief, the Prefect said: "Weber, please go and search the room which Mlle. Levasseur occupied." And, in reply to the nun's protest: "It is indispensable," he declared, "that we should know the reasons why Mlle. Levasseur preserves such an obstinate silence." Florence herself led the way. But, as Weber was leaving the room, Don Luis exclaimed: "Take care, Deputy Chief." "Take care? Why?" "I don't know," said Don Luis, who really could not have said why Florence's behaviour was making him uneasy. "I don't know. Still, I warn you." Weber shrugged his shoulders and, accompanied by the superior, moved away. In the hall he took two men with him. Florence walked ahead. She went up a flight of stairs and turned down a long corridor, with rooms on either side of it, which, after turning a corner, led to a short and very narrow passage ending in a door. This was her room. The door opened, not inward, into the room, but outward, into the passage. Florence therefore drew it to her, stepping back as she did so, which obliged Weber to do likewise. She took advantage of this to rush in and close the door behind her so quickly that the deputy chief, when he tried to grasp the handle, merely struck the air. He made an angry gesture. "The baggage! She means to burn some papers!" And, turning to the superior: "Is there another exit to the room?" "No, monsieur." He tried to open the door, but she had locked and bolted it. Then he stood aside to make way for one of his men, a giant, who, with one blow of his fist, smashed a panel. Weber pushed by him, put his arm through the opening, drew the bolt, turned the key, pulled open the door and entered. Florence was no longer in her room. A little open window opposite showed the way she had taken. "Oh, curse my luck!" he shouted. "She's cut off!" And, hurrying back to the staircase, he roared over the balusters: "Watch all the doors! She's got away! Collar her!" M. Desmalions came hurrying up. Meeting the deputy, he received his explanations and then went on to Florence's room. The open window looked out on a small inner yard, a sort of well which served to ventilate a part of the house. Some rain pipes ran down the wall. Florence must have let herself down by them. But what coolness and what an indomitable will she must have displayed to make her escape in this manner! The detectives had already distributed themselves on every side to bar the fugitive's road. It soon became manifest that Florence, for whom they were hunting on the ground floor and in the basement, had gone from the yard into the room underneath her own, which happened to be the Mother Superior's; that she had put on a nun's habit, and that, thus disguised, she had passed unnoticed through the very men who were pursuing her. They rushed outside; but it was now dark, and every search was bound to be vain in so populous a quarter. The Prefect of Police made no effort to conceal his displeasure. Don Luis was also greatly disappointed at this flight, which thwarted his plans and enlarged openly upon Weber's lack of skill. "I told you so, Deputy Chief. You should have taken your precautions. Mademoiselle Levasseur's attitude ought to have warned you. She evidently knows the criminal and wanted to go to him, ask him for explanations and, for all we can tell, save him, if he managed to convince her. And what will happen between them? When the villain sees that he is discovered, he will be capable of anything." M. Desmalions again questioned the Mother Superior and soon learned that Florence, before taking refuge in the nursing home, had spent 48 hours in some furnished apartments on the Ile Saint Louis. The clue was not worth much, but they could not neglect it. The Prefect of Police, who retained all his doubts with regard to Florence and attached extreme importance to the girl's capture, ordered Weber and his men to follow up this trail without delay. Don Luis accompanied the deputy chief. Events at once showed that the Prefect of Police was right. Florence had taken refuge in the lodging house on the Ile Saint Louis, where she had engaged a room under an assumed name. But she had no sooner arrived than a small boy called at the house, asked for her, and went away with her. They went up to her room and found a parcel done up in a newspaper, containing a nun's habit. The thing was obvious. Later, in the course of the evening, Weber succeeded in discovering the small boy. He was the son of the porter of one of the houses in the neighbourhood. Where could he have taken Florence? When questioned, he definitely refused to betray the lady who had trusted him and who had cried when she kissed him. His mother entreated him. His father boxed his ears. He was inflexible. In any case, it was not unreasonable to conclude that Florence had not left the Ile Saint Louis or its immediate vicinity. The detectives persisted in their search all the evening. Weber established his headquarters in a tap room where every scrap of information was brought to him and where his men returned from time to time to receive his orders. He also remained in constant communication with the Prefect's office. At 10:30 a squad of detectives, sent by the Prefect, placed themselves at the deputy chief's disposal. Mazeroux, newly arrived from Rouen and furious with Florence, joined them. The search continued. Don Luis had gradually assumed its management, and it was he who, so to speak, inspired Weber to ring at this or that door and to question this or that person. At 11 o'clock the hunt still remained fruitless, and Don Luis was the victim of an increasing and irritating restlessness. But shortly after midnight a shrill whistle drew all the men to the eastern extremity of the island, at the end of the Quai d'Anjou. 2 detectives stood waiting for them, surrounded by a small crowd of onlookers. They had just learned that, some distance farther away, on the Quai Henri IV, which does not form part of the island, a motor car had pulled up outside a house, that there was the noise of a dispute, and that the cab had subsequently driven off in the direction of Vincennes. They hastened to the Quai Henri IV, and at once found the house. There was a door on the ground floor opening straight on the pavement. The taxi had stopped for a few minutes in front of this door. 2 persons, a woman and a man leading her along, had left the ground floor flat. When the door of the taxi was shut, a man's voice had shouted from the inside: "Drive down the Boulevard Saint Germain and along the quays, then take the Versailles Road." But the porter's wife was able to furnish more precise particulars. Puzzled by the tenant of the ground floor, whom she had only seen once, in the evening, who paid his rent by cheque signed in the name of Charles and who but very seldom came to his apartment, she had taken advantage of the fact that her lodge was next to the flat to listen to the sound of voices. The man and the woman were arguing. At one moment the man cried in a louder tone: "Come with me, Florence. I insist upon it, and I will give you every proof of my innocence to morrow morning. And if you nevertheless refuse to become my wife, I shall leave the country. All my preparations are made." A little later he began to laugh and, again raising his voice, said: "Afraid of what, Florence? That I shall kill you, perhaps? No, no, have no fear." The portress had heard nothing more. But was this not enough to justify every alarm? Don Luis caught hold of the deputy chief. "Come along. I knew it. The man is capable of anything. It's the tiger. He means to kill her." He rushed outside, dragging the deputy toward the 2 police motors waiting 500 yards down. Meanwhile, Mazeroux was trying to protest. "It would be better to search the house, to pick up some clues." "Oh!" shouted Don Luis, increasing his pace. "The house and the clues will keep. But he's gaining ground, the ruffian, and he has Florence with him. And he's going to kill her. It's a trap. I'm sure of it." He was shouting in the dark, dragging the 2 men along with irresistible force. They neared the motors. "Get ready," he ordered as soon as he was in sight. "I'll drive myself." He tried to get into the driver's seat, but Weber objected and pushed him inside, saying: "Don't trouble, the chauffeur knows his business. He'll drive faster than you would." Don Luis, the deputy chief, and 2 detectives crowded into the cab. Mazeroux took his seat beside the chauffeur. "Versailles Road!" roared Don Luis. The car started, and he continued: "We've got him. You see, it's a magnificent opportunity. He must be going pretty fast, but without forcing the pace, because he doesn't think we're after him. Oh, the villain! We'll make him sit up. Quicker, driver! But what the devil are we loaded up like this for? You and I, Deputy Chief, would have been enough. Hi, Mazeroux, get down and jump into the other car. That'll be better, won't it, Deputy? It's absurd." He interrupted himself, and as he was sitting on the back seat, between the deputy chief and the detective, he rose toward the window and muttered: "Why, look here, what's the idiot doing? That's not the road. I say, what does this mean?" A roar of laughter was the only answer. It came from Weber, who was shaking with delight. Don Luis stifled an oath and, making a tremendous effort, tried to leap from the car. 6 hands fell upon him and held him motionless. The deputy chief had him by the throat. The detectives clutched his arms. There was no room for him to struggle within the restricted space of the small car, and he felt the cold iron of a revolver on his temple. "None of your nonsense," growled Weber, "or I'll blow out your brains, my boy. Ha ha! You didn't expect this. It's Weber's revenge, eh?" And when Perenna continued to wriggle, he went on in a threatening tone: "You'll have only yourself to blame, mind. I'm going to count 3. 1, 2 " "But what's this all about?" bellowed Don Luis. "Prefect's orders, received just now." "What orders?" "To take you to the lockup if the Florence girl escaped us again." "Have you a warrant?" "I have." "And what next?" "What next? Nothing. The Santé, the examining magistrate." "But hang it all, the tiger's making tracks meanwhile. Oh, rot! Is it possible to be so dense? What mugs those fellows are! Oh, dash it!" He was fuming with rage, and when he saw that they were driving into the prison yard, he gathered all his strength, knocked the revolver out of the deputy's hand, and stunned one of the detectives with a blow of his fist. But 10 men came crowding round the doors. Resistance was useless. He understood this, and his rage increased. "The idiots!" he shouted, while they surrounded him and searched him at the door of the office. "The rotters! The bunglers! To go mucking up a job like that! They can lay hands on the villain if they want to, and they lock up the honest man, while the villain makes himself scarce. And he'll do more murder yet. Florence! Florence!" Under the lamplight, in the midst of the detectives holding him, he was magnificent in his helpless violence. They dragged him away. With an unparalleled display of strength, he drew himself up, shook off the men who were hanging on to him like a pack of hounds worrying some animal at bay, got rid of Weber, and accosted Mazeroux in familiar tones. He was gloriously masterful, almost calm, so wholly did he appear to control his seething rage. He gave his orders in breathless little sentences, curt as words of command. "Mazeroux, run around to the Prefect's. Ask him to ring up Valenglay. Yes, the Prime Minister. I want to see him. Have him informed. Ask the Prefect to say it's I, the man who made the German Emperor play his game. My name? He knows. Or if he forgets, the Prefect can tell him my name." He paused for a second or two, and then, calmer still, he declared: "Arsène Lupin. Telephone those 2 words to him and just say this: Arsène Lupin wishes to speak to the Prime Minister on very important business. Get that through to him at once. The Prime Minister would be very angry if he heard afterward that they had neglected to communicate my request. Go, Mazeroux, and then find the villain's tracks again." The governor of the prison had opened the jail book. "You can enter my name, Monsieur le Directeur," said Don Luis. "Put down Arsène Lupin." The governor smiled and said: "I should find a difficulty in putting down any other. It's on the warrant: Arsène Lupin, alias Don Luis Perenna." Don Luis felt a little shudder pass through him at the sound of those words. The fact that he was arrested under the name of Arsène Lupin made his position doubly dangerous. "Ah," he said, "so they've resolved." "I should think so," said Weber, in a tone of triumph. "We're resolved to take the bull by the horns and to go straight for Lupin. Plucky of us, eh? Never fear, we'll show you something better than that." Don Luis did not flinch. Turning to Mazeroux again, he said: "Don't forget my instructions, Mazeroux." But there was a fresh blow in store for him. The sergeant did not answer his remark. Don Luis watched him closely and once more gave a start. He had just perceived that Mazeroux was also surrounded by men who were holding him tight, and the poor sergeant stood silently shedding tears. Weber's liveliness increased. "You'll have to excuse him, Lupin. Sergeant Mazeroux accompanies you to prison, though not in the same cell." "Ah!" said Don Luis, drawing himself up. "Is Mazeroux put into jail?" "Prefect's orders. Warrant duly executed." "And on what charge?" "Accomplice of Arsène Lupin." "Mazeroux, my accomplice? Get out! Mazeroux, the most honest man that ever lived." "The most honest man that ever lived, as you say. That didn't prevent people from going to him when they wanted to write to you, or prevent him from bringing you the letters. Which proves that he knew where you were hanging out. And there's a good deal more which we'll explain to you, Lupin, in good time. You'll have plenty of fun, I assure you." Don Luis murmured: "My poor Mazeroux." Then, raising his voice, he said: Don't cry, old chap. It's just a matter of the remainder of the night. Yes, I'll share my cards with you, and we'll turn the king and mark game in a very few hours. Don't cry. I've got a much finer berth waiting for you, a more honourable and, above all, a more lucrative position. I have just what you want. You don't imagine, surely, that I wasn't prepared for this? Why, you know me. Take it from me, I shall be at liberty to morrow, and the government, after setting you free, will pitch you into a colonelcy or something, with a marshal's pay attached to it. So don't cry, Mazeroux." Then, addressing Weber, he said to him in the voice of a principal giving an order and knowing that the order will be executed without discussion: "Monsieur, I will ask you to fulfil the confidential mission which I was entrusting to Mazeroux. First, inform the Prefect of Police that I have a communication of the very highest importance to make to the Prime Minister. Next, discover the tiger's tracks at Versailles before the night is over. I know your merit, Monsieur, and I rely entirely upon your diligence and your zeal. Meet me at 12 o'clock to morrow." And still maintaining his attitude of a principal who has given his instructions, he allowed himself to be taken to his cell. It was 10 to 1. For the last 50 minutes, the enemy had been bowling along the high road, carrying off Florence like a prey which it now seemed impossible to snatch from him. The door was locked and bolted. Don Luis reflected: "Even presuming that Monsieur le Préfet consents to ring up Valenglay, he won't do so before the morning. So they've given the villain 8 hours' start before I'm free. 8 hours! Curse it!" He thought a little longer, then shrugged his shoulders with the air of one who, for the moment, has nothing better to do than wait, and flung himself on his mattress, murmuring: "Hush-a-bye, Lupin." Chapter 17 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 17. Open Sesame. In spite of his usual facility for sleep, Don Luis slept for 3 hours at most. He was racked with too much anxiety; and though his plan of conduct was worked out mathematically, he could not help foreseeing all the obstacles which were likely to frustrate that plan. Of course, Weber would speak to M. Desmalions. But would M. Desmalions telephone to Valenglay? "He is sure to telephone," Don Luis declared, stamping his foot. "It doesn't let him in for anything. And, at the same time, he would be running a big risk if he refused, especially as Valenglay must have been consulted about my arrest and is obviously kept informed of all that happens." He next asked himself what exactly Valenglay could do, once he was told. For, after all, was it not too much to expect that the head of the government, that the Prime Minister should put himself out to obey the injunctions and assist the schemes of M. Arsène Lupin? "He will come!" he cried, with the same persistent confidence. "Valenglay doesn't care a hang for form and ceremony and all that nonsense. He will come, even if it is only out of curiosity, to learn what the Kaiser's friend can have to say to him. Besides, he knows me. I am not one of those beggars who inconvenience people for nothing. There's always something to be gained by meeting me. He'll come." But another question at once presented itself to his mind. Valenglay's coming in no way implied his consent to the bargain which Perenna meant to propose to him. And even if Don Luis succeeded in convincing him, what risks remained! How many doubtful points to overcome! And then the possibilities of failure! Would Weber pursue the fugitive's motor car with the necessary decision and boldness? Would he get on the track again? And, having got on the track, would he be certain not to lose it? And then, even supposing that all the chances were favourable, was it not too late? Taking for granted that they hunted down the wild beast, that they drove him to bay, would he not meanwhile have killed his prey? Knowing himself beaten, would a monster of that kind hesitate to add one more murder to the long list of his crimes? And this, to Don Luis, was the crowning terror. After all the difficulties which, in his stubbornly confident imagination, he had managed to surmount, he was brought face to face with the horrible vision of Florence being sacrificed, of Florence dead. "Oh, the torture of it!" he stammered. "I alone could have succeeded, and they shut me up." He hardly put himself out to inquire into the reasons for which M. Desmalions, suddenly changing his mind, had consented to his arrest, thus bringing back to life that troublesome Arsène Lupin, with whom the police had not hitherto cared to hamper themselves. No, that did not interest him. Florence alone mattered; and the minutes passed; and each minute wasted brought Florence nearer to her doom. He remembered a similar occasion when, some years before, he waited in the same way for the door of his cell to open and the German Emperor to appear. But how much greater was the solemnity of the present moment! Before, it was at the very most his liberty that was at stake. This time it was Florence's life which fate was about to offer or refuse him. "Florence, Florence!" he kept repeating in his despair. He no longer had a doubt of her innocence, nor did he doubt that the other loved her and had carried her off not so much for the hostage of a coveted fortune as for a love spoil which a man destroys if he cannot keep it. Florence, Florence! He was suffering from an extraordinary fit of depression. His defeat seemed irretrievable. There was no question of hastening after Florence, of catching the murderer. Don Luis was in prison under his own name of Arsène Lupin; and the whole problem lay in knowing how long he would remain there: for months or for years. It was then that he fully realized what his love for Florence meant. He perceived that it took the place in his life of his former passions, his craving for luxury, his desire for mastery, his pleasure in fighting, his ambition, his revenge. For 2 months he had been struggling to win her and for nothing else. The search after the truth and the punishment of the criminal were to him no more than means of saving Florence from the dangers that threatened her. If Florence had to die, if it was too late to snatch her from the enemy, in that case he might as well remain in prison. Arsène Lupin spending the rest of his days in a convict settlement was a fitting end to the spoilt life of a man who had not even been able to win the love of the only woman he had really loved. It was a passing mood and, being totally opposed to Don Luis's nature, finished abruptly in a state of utter confidence which no longer admitted the least particle of anxiety or doubt. The sun had risen. The cell gradually became filled with daylight; and Don Luis remembered that Valenglay reached his office on the Place Beauvau at 7 o'clock in the morning. From this moment he felt absolutely calm. Coming events presented an entirely different aspect to him, as though they had, so to speak, turned right round. The contest seemed to him easy, the facts free from complications. He understood as clearly as if the actions had been performed that his will could not but be obeyed. The deputy chief must inevitably have made a faithful report to the Prefect of Police. The Prefect of Police must inevitably that morning have transmitted Arsène Lupin's request to Valenglay. Valenglay would inevitably give himself the pleasure of an interview with Arsène Lupin. Arsène Lupin would inevitably, in the course of that interview, obtain Valenglay's consent. These were not suppositions, but certainties; not problems awaiting solution, but problems already solved. Starting from A and continuing along B and C, you arrive, whether you wish it or not, at D. Don Luis began to laugh. Come, Arsène, old chap, remember that you brought Mr. Hohenzollern all the way from his Brandenburg Marches. Valenglay does not live as far as that, by Jove, and if necessary you can put yourself out a little. That's it. I'll consent to take the first step. I will go and call on Monsieur de Beauveau. Monsieur Valenglay, it is a pleasure to see you." He went gaily to the door, pretending that it was open and that he had only to walk through to be received when his turn came. He repeated this child's play 3 times, bowing low and long, as though holding a plumed hat in his hand and murmuring, "Open sesame." At the 4th time the door opened and a warder appeared. Don Luis said, in a ceremonious tone: "I hope I have not kept the Prime Minister waiting." There were 4 inspectors in the corridor. "Are these gentlemen my escort?" he asked. "That's right. Announce Arsène Lupin, Grandee of Spain, His Most Catholic Majesty's cousin. My lords, I follow you. Turnkey, here are 20 crowns for your pains, my friend." He stopped in the corridor. "By Jupiter, no gloves! And I haven't shaved since yesterday." The inspectors had surrounded him and were pushing him a little roughly. He seized 2 of them by the arm. They groaned. "That'll teach you," he said. "You've no orders to thrash me, have you? Nor even to handcuff me? That being so, young fellows, behave." The prison governor was standing in the hall. "I've had a capital night, my dear governor," said Don. "Your CTC rooms are the very acme of comfort. I'll see that the Lock-up Arms receives a star in the Baedeker. Would you like me to write you a testimonial in your jail book? You wouldn't? Perhaps you hope to see me again? Sorry, my dear governor, but it's impossible. I have other things to do." The motor car was waiting in the yard. Don Luis stepped in with the 4 detectives. "Place Beauvau," he said to the driver. "No, Rue Vineuse," said one of the detectives, correcting him. "Oh, ho!" said Don Luis. "His Excellency's private residence. His Excellency prefers that my visit should be kept secret. That's a good sign. By the way, dear friends, what's the time?" His question remained unanswered; and, as the detectives had drawn the blinds, he was unable to consult the clocks in the street. It was not until he was at Valenglay's, in the Prime Minister's little ground floor flat near the Trocadero, that he saw a clock on the mantelpiece. "7:15!" he exclaimed. "Good! There's not been much time lost." Valenglay's study opened on a flight of steps that ran down to a garden filled with aviaries. The room itself was crammed with books and pictures. A bell rang, and the detectives went out, following the old maidservant who had shown them in. Don Luis was left alone. He was still calm, but nevertheless felt a certain uneasiness, a longing to be up and doing, to throw himself into the fray; and his eyes kept on involuntarily returning to the face of the clock. The minute hand seemed endowed with extraordinary speed. At last some one entered, ushering in a second person. Don Luis recognized Valenglay and the Prefect of Police. "That's it," he thought. "I've got him." He saw this by the sort of vague sympathy perceptible on the old Premier's lean and bony face. There was not a sign of arrogance, nothing to raise a barrier between the minister and the suspicious individual whom he was receiving. Just a manifest, playful curiosity and sympathy. It was a sympathy which Valenglay had never concealed, and of which he even boasted when, after Arsène Lupin's sham death, he spoke of the adventurer and the strange relations between them. "You have not changed," he said, after looking at him for some time. "Complexion a little darker, a trifle greyer over the temples, that's all." And putting on a blunt tone, he asked: "And what is it you want?" "An answer, first of all, Monsieur le Président du Conseil. Has Deputy Chief Weber, who took me to the lockup last night, traced the motor cab in which Florence Levasseur was carried off?" "Yes, the motor stopped at Versailles. The persons inside it hired another cab, which is to take them to Nantes. What else do you ask for, besides that answer?" "My liberty, Monsieur le Président." "At once, of course," said Valenglay, beginning to laugh. "In 30 or 35 minutes at most." "At 7:30, eh?" "7:30 at latest, Monsieur le Président." "And why your liberty?" "To catch the murderer of Cosmo Mornington, of Inspector Vérot, and of the Roussel family." "Are you the only one that can catch him?" "Yes." "Still, the police are moving. The wires are at work. The murderer will not leave France. He shan't escape us." "You can't find him." "Yes, we can." "In that case, he will kill Florence Levasseur. She will be the scoundrel's seventh victim, and it will be your doing." Valenglay paused for a moment and then resumed: "According to you, contrary to all appearances, and contrary to the well grounded suspicions of Monsieur le Préfet de Police, Florence Levasseur is innocent?" "Oh, absolutely, Monsieur le Président." "And you believe her to be in danger of death?" "She is in danger of death." "Are you in love with her?" "I am." Valenglay experienced a little thrill of enjoyment. Lupin in love! Lupin acting through love and confessing his love! But how exciting! He said: "I have followed the Mornington case from day to day, and I know every detail of it. You have done wonders, Monsieur. It is evident that, but for you, the case would never have emerged from the mystery that surrounded it at the start. But I cannot help noticing that there are certain flaws in it. These flaws, which astonished me on your part, are more easy to understand when we know that love was the primary motive and the object of your actions. On the other hand, and in spite of what you say, Florence Levasseur's conduct, her claims as the heiress, her unexpected escape from the hospital, leave little doubt in our minds as to the part which she is playing." Don Luis pointed to the clock. "Monsieur le Ministre, it is getting late." Valenglay burst out laughing. "I never met any one like you. Don Luis Perenna, I am sorry that I am not some absolute monarch. I should make you the head of my secret police." "A post which the German Emperor has already offered me." "Oh, nonsense!" "And I refused it." Valenglay laughed heartily, but the clock struck 7. Don Luis began to grow anxious. Valenglay sat down and, coming straight to the point, said, in a serious voice: "Don Luis Perenna, on the first day of your reappearance, that is to say, at the very moment of the murders on the Boulevard Suchet, Monsieur le Préfet de Police and I made up our minds as to your identity. Perenna was Lupin. I have no doubt that you understood the reason why we did not wish to bring back to life the dead man that you were, and why we granted you a sort of protection. Monsieur le Préfet de Police was entirely of my opinion. The work which you were pursuing was a salutary work of justice, and your assistance was so valuable to us that we strove to spare you any sort of annoyance. As Don Luis Perenna was fighting the good fight, we left Arsène Lupin in the background. Unfortunately," Valenglay paused again and declared, "unfortunately, Monsieur le Préfet de Police last night received a denunciation, supported by detailed proofs, accusing you of being Arsène Lupin." "Impossible!" cried Don Luis. "That is a statement which no one is able to prove by material evidence. Arsène Lupin is dead." "If you like," Valenglay agreed. "But that does not show that Don Luis Perenna is alive. Don Luis Perenna has a duly legalized existence, Monsieur le Président." "Perhaps, but it is disputed." "By whom? There is only one man who would have the right. And to accuse me would be his own undoing. I cannot believe him to be stupid enough, no, but crafty enough, yes." "You mean Caceres, the Peruvian attaché?" "Yes." "But he is abroad." "More than that, he is a fugitive from justice, after embezzling the funds of his legation. But before leaving the country he signed a statement that reached us yesterday evening, declaring that he faked up a complete record for you under the name of Don Luis Perenna. Here is your correspondence with him, and here are all the papers establishing the truth of his allegations. Any one will be convinced, on examining them, first, that you are not Don Luis Perenna, and secondly, that you are Arsène Lupin." Don Luis made an angry gesture. "That blackguard of a Caceres is a mere tool," he snarled. "The other man's behind him, has paid him, and is controlling his actions. It's the scoundrel himself. I recognize his touch. He has once more tried to get rid of me at the decisive moment." "I am quite willing to believe it," said the Prime Minister. "But as all these documents, according to the letter that came with them, are only photographs, and as, if you are not arrested this morning, the originals are to be handed to a leading Paris newspaper to night, we are obliged to take note of the accusation." "But, Monsieur le Président," exclaimed Don Luis, "as Caceres is abroad and as the scoundrel who bought the papers of him was also obliged to take to flight before he was able to execute his threats, there is no fear now that the documents will be handed to the press." "How do we know? The enemy must have taken his precautions. He may have accomplices." "He has none." "How do we know?" Don Luis looked at Valenglay and said: "What is it that you really wish to say, Monsieur le Président?" "I will tell you. Although pressure was brought to bear upon us by Caceres's threats, Monsieur le Préfet de Police, anxious to see all possible light shed on the plot played by Florence Levasseur, did not interfere with your last night's expedition. As that expedition led to nothing, he determined, at any rate, to profit by the fact that Don Luis had placed himself at our disposal and to arrest Arsène Lupin. If we now let him go, the documents will certainly be published; and you can see the absurd and ridiculous position in which that will place us in the eyes of the public. Well, at this very moment, you ask for the release of Arsène Lupin, a release which would be illegal, uncalled for, and inexcusable. I am obliged, therefore, to refuse it; and I do refuse it." He ceased, and then, after a few seconds, he added: "Unless " "Unless?" asked Don Luis. "Unless and this is what I wanted to say unless you offer me in exchange something so extraordinary and so tremendous that I could consent to risk the annoyance which the absurd release of Arsène Lupin would bring down upon my head." "But, Monsieur le Président, surely, if I bring you the real criminal, the murderer of " "I don't need your assistance for that." "And if I give you my word of honour, Monsieur le Président, to return the moment my task is done and give myself up?" Valenglay struck the table with his fist and, raising his voice, addressed Don Luis with a certain genial familiarity. "Come, Arsène Lupin," he said, "play the game. If you really want to have your way, pay for it. Hang it all, remember that after all this business, and especially after the incidents of last night, you and Florence Levasseur will be to the public what you already are: the responsible actors in the tragedy, nay, more, the real and only criminals. And it is now, when Florence Levasseur has taken to her heels, that you come and ask me for your liberty. Very well, but, damn it, set a price to it and don't haggle with me." "I am not haggling, Monsieur le Président," declared Don Luis in a very straightforward manner and tone. "What I have to offer you is certainly much more extraordinary and tremendous than you imagine. But if it were twice as extraordinary and twice as tremendous, it would not count once Florence Levasseur's life is in danger. Nevertheless, I was entitled to try for a less expensive transaction. Of this your words remove all hope. I will therefore lay my cards upon the table, as you demand, and as I had made up my mind to do." He sat down opposite Valenglay in the attitude of a man treating with another on equal terms. "I shall not be long. A single sentence, Monsieur le Président, will express the bargain which I am proposing to the Prime Minister of my country." And, looking at Valenglay straight in the eyes, he said slowly, syllable by syllable: "In exchange for 24 hours' liberty, and no more, undertaking on my honour to return here to morrow morning, and to return here either with Florence, to give you every proof of her innocence, or without her, to constitute myself a prisoner, I offer you," he took his time and in a serious voice concluded, "I offer you a kingdom, Monsieur le Président du Conseil." The sentence sounded bombastic and ludicrous, sounded silly enough to provoke a shrug of the shoulders, sounded like one of those sentences which only an imbecile or a lunatic could utter. And yet Valenglay remained impassive. He knew that in such circumstances as the present, the man before him was not the man to indulge in jesting. And he knew it so fully that, instinctively, accustomed as he was to momentous political questions in which secrecy is of the utmost importance, he cast a glance toward the Prefect of Police, as though M. Desmalions's presence in the room hindered him. "I positively insist," said Don Luis, "that Monsieur le Préfet de Police shall stay and hear what I have to say. He is better able than any one else to appreciate the value of it, and he will bear witness to its correctness in certain particulars." "Speak," said Valenglay. His curiosity knew no bounds. He did not much care whether Don Luis's proposal could have any practical results. In his heart he did not believe in it. But what he wanted to know was the lengths to which that demon of audacity was prepared to go, and on what new prodigious adventure he based the pretensions which he was putting forward so calmly and frankly. Don Luis smiled. "Will you allow me?" he asked. Rising and going to the mantelpiece, he took down from the wall a small map representing Northwest Africa. He spread it on the table, placed different objects on the four corners to hold it in position, and resumed: "There is one matter, Monsieur le Président, which puzzled Monsieur le Préfet de Police and about which I know that he caused inquiries to be made. And that matter is how I employed my time, or rather how Arsène Lupin employed his time during the last 3 years of his service with the Foreign Legion." "Those inquiries were made by my orders," said Valenglay. "And they led?" "To nothing." "So that you do not know what I did during my captivity?" "Just so." "I will tell you, Monsieur le Président. It will not take me long." Don Luis pointed with a pencil to a spot in Morocco marked on the map. "It was here that I was taken prisoner on the 24th of July. My capture seemed queer to Monsieur le Préfet de Police and to all who subsequently heard the details of the incident. They were astonished that I should have been foolish enough to get caught in ambush and to allow myself to be trapped by a troop of 40 Berber horse. Their surprise is justified. My capture was a deliberate move on my part. You will perhaps remember, Monsieur le Président, that I enlisted in the Foreign Legion after making a fruitless attempt to kill myself in consequence of some really terrible private disasters. I wanted to die, and I thought that a Moorish bullet would give me the final rest for which I longed. Fortune did not permit it. My destiny, it seemed, was not yet fulfilled. Then what had to be was. Little by little, unknown to myself, the thought of death vanished, and I recovered my love of life. A few rather striking feats of arms had given me back all my self-confidence and all my desire for action. New dreams seized hold of me. I fell a victim to a new ideal. From day to day I needed more space, greater independence, wider horizons, more unforeseen and personal sensations. The Legion, great as my affection was for the plucky fellows who had welcomed me so cordially, was no longer enough to satisfy my craving for activity. One day, without thinking much about it, in a blind prompting of my whole being toward a great adventure which I did not clearly see, but which attracted me in a mysterious fashion, one day, finding myself surrounded by a band of the enemy, though still in a position to fight, I allowed myself to be captured. That is the whole story, Monsieur le Président. As a prisoner, I was free. A new life opened before me. However, the incident nearly turned out badly. My 36 Berbers, a troop detached from an important nomad tribe that used to pillage and put to ransom the districts lying on the middle chains of the Atlas range, first galloped back to the little cluster of tents where the wives of their chiefs were encamped, under the guard of some 10 men. They packed off at once, and after a week's march which I found pretty arduous, for I was on foot, with my hands tied behind my back, following a mounted party, they stopped on a narrow upland commanded by rocky slopes and covered with skeletons mouldering among the stones and with remains of French swords and other weapons. Here they planted a stake in the ground and fastened me to it. I gathered from the behaviour of my captors, and from a few words which I overheard, that my death was decided on. They meant to cut off my ears, nose and tongue, and then my head. However, they began by preparing their repast. They went to a well close by, ate and drank and took no further notice of me, except to laugh at me and describe the various treats they held in store for me. Another night passed. The torture was postponed until the morning, a time that suited them better. At break of day they crowded round me, uttering yells and shouts with which were mingled the shrill cries of the women. When my shadow covered a line which they had marked on the sand the night before, they ceased their din, and one of them, who was to perform the surgical operations prescribed for me, stepped forward and ordered me to put out my tongue. I did so. He took hold of it with a corner of his burnous and, with his other hand, drew his dagger from its sheath. I shall never forget the ferocity, coupled with ingenuous delight, of his expression, which was like that of a mischievous boy amusing himself by breaking a bird's wings and legs. Nor shall I ever forget the man's stupefaction when he saw that his dagger no longer consisted of anything but the pommel and a harmless and ridiculously small stump of the blade, just long enough to keep it in its sheath. His fury was revealed by a splutter of curses, and he at once rushed at one of his friends and snatched his dagger from him. The same stupefaction followed. This dagger was also broken off at the hilt. The next thing was a general tumult, in which one and all brandished their knives. But all of them uttered howls of rage. There were 45 men there, and their 45 knives were smashed. The chief flew at me as if holding me responsible for this incomprehensible phenomenon. He was a tall, lean old man, slightly hunchbacked, blind of one eye, hideous to look upon. He aimed a huge pistol point blank at my head, and he struck me as so ugly that I burst out laughing in his face. He pulled the trigger. The pistol missed fire. He pulled it again. The pistol again missed fire. All of them at once began to dance around the stake to which I was fastened. Gesticulating wildly, hustling one another and roaring like thunder, they levelled their various firearms at me: muskets, pistols, carbines, old Spanish blunderbusses. The hammers clicked, but the muskets, pistols, carbines and blunderbusses did not go off. It was a regular miracle. You should have seen their faces. I never laughed so much in my life. And this completed their bewilderment. Some ran to the tents for more powder. Others hurriedly reloaded their arms, only to meet with fresh failure, while I did nothing but laugh and laugh. The thing could not go on indefinitely. There were plenty of other means of doing away with me. They had their hands to strangle me with, the butt ends of their muskets to smash my head with, pebbles to stone me with. And there were over 40 of them. The old chief picked up a bulky stone and stepped toward me, his features distorted with hatred. He raised himself to his full height, lifted the huge block, with the assistance of 2 of his men, above my head and dropped it, in front of me, on the stake. It was a staggering sight for the poor old man. I had in 1 second unfastened my bonds and sprung backward, and I was standing at 3 paces from him, with my hands outstretched before me, and holding in those outstretched hands the 2 revolvers which had been taken from me on the day of my capture. What followed was the business of a few seconds. The chief now began to laugh as I had laughed, sarcastically. To his mind, in the disorder of his brain, those 2 revolvers with which I threatened him could have no more effect than the useless weapons which had spared my life. He took up a large pebble and raised his hand to hurl it at my face. His 2 assistants did the same. And all the others were prepared to follow his example. "Hands down!" I cried, "or I fire." The chief let fly his stone. At the same moment 3 shots rang out. The chief and his 2 men fell dead to the ground. "Who's next?" I asked, looking round the band. 42 Moors remained. I had 11 bullets left. As none of the men budged, I slipped one of my revolvers under my arm and took from my pocket 2 small boxes of cartridges containing 50 more bullets. And from my belt I drew 3 great knives, all of them nicely tapering and pointed. Half of the troop made signs of submission and drew up in a line behind me. The other half capitulated a moment after. The battle was over. It had not lasted 4 minutes. Chapter 18 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 18. Arsène I, Emperor of Mauritania. Don Luis ceased. A smile of amusement played round his lips. The recollection of those 4 minutes seemed to divert him immensely. Valenglay and the Prefect of Police, who were neither of them men to be unduly surprised at courage and coolness, had listened to him nevertheless, and were now looking at him in bewildered silence. Was it possible for a human being to carry heroism to such unlikely lengths? Meanwhile he went up to the other side of the chimney and pointed to a larger map representing the French roads. "You told me, Monsieur le Président, that the scoundrel's motor car had left Versailles and was going toward Nantes." "Yes, and all our arrangements are made to arrest him either on the way, or else at Nantes or at Saint-Nazaire, where he may intend to take ship." Don Luis Perenna followed with his forefinger the road across France, stopping here and there, marking successive stages. And nothing could have been more impressive than this dumb show. The man that he was, preserving his composure amid the overthrow of all that he had most at heart, seemed by his calmness to dominate time and circumstances. It was as though the murderer were running away at one point of an unbreakable thread of which Don Luis held the other, and as though Don Luis could stop his flight at any time by a mere movement of his finger and thumb. As he studied the map, the master seemed to command not only a sheet of cardboard, but also the high road on which a motor car was spinning along, subject to his despotic will. He went back to the table and continued. The battle was over, and there was no question of its being resumed. My 42 worthies found themselves face to face with a conqueror, against whom revenge is always possible, by fair means or foul, but with one who had subjugated them in a supernatural manner. There was no other explanation of the inexplicable facts which they had witnessed. I was a sorcerer, a kind of marabout, a direct emissary of the Prophet. Valenglay laughed and said: "Their interpretation was not so very unreasonable, for after all you must have performed a sleight of hand trick which strikes me also as being little less than miraculous." Monsieur le Président, do you know a curious short story of Balzac's called A Passion in the Desert?" "Yes." "Well, the key to the riddle lies in that." "Does it? I don't quite see. You were not under the claws of a tigress. There was no tigress to tame in this instance." "No, but there were women." "Eh? How do you mean?" "Upon my word, Monsieur le Président," said Don Luis gaily, "I should not like to shock you, but I repeat that the troop which carried me off on that week's march included women, and women are a little like Balzac's tigress, creatures whom it is not impossible to tame, to charm, to break in until you make friends of them." "Yes, yes," muttered the Premier, madly puzzled. "But that needs time." "I had a week." "And complete liberty of action." "No, no, Monsieur le Président, the eyes are enough to start with. The eyes give rise to sympathy, interest, affection, curiosity, a wish to know you better. After that, the merest opportunity." "And did an opportunity offer?" "Yes, one night. I was fastened up, or at least they thought I was. I knew that the chief's favourite was alone in her tent close by. I went there. I left her an hour afterward." "And the tigress was tamed?" "Yes, as thoroughly as Balzac's, tamed and blindly submissive." "But there were several of them." "I know, Monsieur le Préfet, and that was the difficulty. I was afraid of rivalry. But all went well. The favourite was not jealous, far from it. And then, as I have told you, her submission was absolute. In short, I had 5 staunch, invisible friends, resolved to do anything I wanted, and suspected by nobody. My plan was being carried out before we reached the last halting place. My 5 secret agents collected all the arms during the night. They dashed the daggers to the ground and broke them. They removed the bullets from the pistols. They damped the powder. Everything was ready for ringing up the curtain." Valenglay bowed. "My compliments. You are a man of resource. And your scheme was not lacking in charm. For I take it that your 5 ladies were pretty." Don Luis put on a bantering expression. He closed his eyes, as if to recall his bliss, and let fall the one word: "Hags." The epithet gave rise to a burst of merriment, but Don Luis, as though in a hurry to finish his story, at once went on: "In any case, they saved my life, the hussies, and their aid never failed me. My 42 watchdogs, deprived of their arms and shaking with fear in those solitudes where everything is a trap and where death lies in wait for you at any minute, gathered round me as their real protector. When we joined the great tribe to which they belonged, I was their actual chief. And it took me less than 3 months of dangers faced in common, of ambushes defeated under my advice, of raids and pillages effected by my direction, to become the chief also of the whole tribe. I spoke their language, I practised their religion, I wore their dress, I conformed to their customs. Alas, had I not 5 wives? Henceforward, my dream, which had gradually taken definite shape in my mind, became possible. I sent one of my most faithful adherents to France, with 60 letters to hand to 60 men whose names and addresses he learned by heart. Those 60 men were 60 associates whom Arsène Lupin had disbanded before he threw himself from the Capri cliffs. All had retired from business, with 100,000 francs apiece in ready money, and a small trade or public post to keep them occupied. I had provided one with a tobacconist's shop, another with a job as a park keeper, others with sinecures in the government offices. In short, they were respectable citizens. To all of them, whether public servants, farmers, municipal councillors, grocers, sacristans, or what not, I wrote the same letter, made the same offer, and gave the same instructions in case they should accept. Monsieur le Président, I thought that of the 60, 10 or 15 at most would come and join me. 60 came, Monsieur le Président, 60, and not one less. 60 men punctually arrived at the appointed place. On the day fixed, at the hour named, my old armed cruiser, the Ascendam, which they had brought back, anchored in the mouth of the Wadi Dra, on the Atlantic coast between Cape Nun and Cape Juby. 2 longboats plied to and fro and landed my friends and the munitions of war which they had brought with them: camp furniture, quick-firing guns, ammunition, motor boats, stores and provisions, trading wares, glass beads, and cases of gold as well, for my 60 good men and true had insisted on turning their share of the old profits into cash and on putting into the new venture the 6 million francs which they had received from their governor. Need I say more, Monsieur le Président? Must I tell you what a chief like Arsène Lupin was able to attempt, seconded by 60 fine fellows of that stamp and backed by an army of 10,000 well-armed and well-trained Moorish fanatics? He attempted it, and his success was unparalleled. I do not think that there has ever been an idyll like that through which we lived during those 15 months, first on the heights of the Atlas range, and then in the infernal plains of the Sahara, an idyll of heroism, of privation, of superhuman torture and superhuman joy. An idyll of hunger and thirst, of total defeat and dazzling victory. My 60 trusty followers threw themselves into their work with might and main. Oh, what men! You know them, Monsieur le Président du Conseil. You've had them to deal with, Monsieur le Préfet de Police. The beggars! Tears come to my eyes when I think of some of them. There were Charolais and his son, who distinguished themselves in the case of the Princesse de Lamballe's tiara. There were Marco, who owed his fame to the Kesselbach case, and Auguste, who was your chief messenger, Monsieur le Président. There were the Growler and the Masher, who achieved such glory in the hunt for the crystal stopper. There were the brothers Beuzeville, whom I used to call the two Ajaxes. There were Philippe d'Antrac, who was better born than any Bourbon, and Pierre le Grand, and Tristan Leroux, and Joseph le Jeune. And there was Arsène Lupin, said Valenglay, roused to enthusiasm by this list of Homeric heroes. And there was Arsène Lupin, repeated Don Luis. He nodded his head, smiled, and continued in a very quiet voice: I will not speak of him, Monsieur le Président. I will not speak of him for the simple reason that you would not believe my story. What they tell about him when he was with the Foreign Legion is mere child's play beside what was to come later. Lupin was only a private soldier. In South Morocco he was a general. Not till then did Arsène Lupin really show what he could do. And I say it without pride, not even I foresaw what that was. The Achilles of the legend performed no greater feats. Hannibal and Caesar achieved no more striking results. All I need tell you is that, in 15 months, Arsène Lupin conquered a kingdom twice the size of France. From the Berbers of Morocco, from the indomitable Tuaregs, from the Arabs of the extreme south of Algeria, from the Negroes who overrun Senegal, from the Moors along the Atlantic coast, under the blazing sun, in the flames of hell, he conquered half the Sahara and what we may call ancient Mauritania. A kingdom of deserts and swamps? Partly, but a kingdom all the same, with oases, wells, rivers, forests, and incalculable riches, a kingdom with 10 million men and 100,000 warriors. This is the kingdom which I offer to France, Monsieur le Président du Conseil. Valenglay did not conceal his amazement. Greatly excited and even perturbed by what he had learned, looking over his extraordinary visitor, with his hands clutching at the map of Africa, he whispered: Explain yourself. Be more precise. Don Luis answered: Monsieur le Président du Conseil, I will not remind you of the events of the last few years. France, resolving to pursue a splendid dream of dominion over North Africa, has had to part with a portion of the Congo. I propose to heal the painful wound by giving her 30 times as much as she has lost. And I turn the magnificent and distant dream by joining the small slice of Morocco which you have conquered to Senegal at one blow. Today, Greater France in Africa exists. Thanks to me, it is a solid and compact expanse. Millions of square miles of territory, and a coastline stretching for several thousand miles from Tunis to the Congo, save for a few insignificant interruptions. It's a utopia, Valenglay protested. It's a reality. Nonsense! It will take us 20 years fighting to achieve. It will take you exactly 5 minutes, cried Don Luis, with irresistible enthusiasm. What I offer you is not the conquest of an empire, but a conquered empire, duly pacified and administered, in full working order and full of life. My gift is a present, not a future gift. I, too, Monsieur le Président du Conseil, I, Arsène Lupin, had cherished a splendid dream. After toiling and moiling all my life, after knowing all the ups and downs of existence, richer than Croesus, because all the wealth of the world was mine, and poorer than Job, because I had distributed all my treasures, surfeited with everything, tired of unhappiness, and more tired still of happiness, sick of pleasure, of passion, of excitement, I wanted to do something that is incredible in the present day: to reign. And a still more incredible phenomenon, when this thing was accomplished, when the dead Arsène Lupin had come to life again, as a sultan out of the Arabian Nights, as a reigning, governing, law-giving Arsène Lupin, head of the state and head of the church, I determined in a few years, at one stroke, to tear down the screen of rebel tribes against which you were waging a desultory and tiresome war in the north of Morocco, while I was quietly and silently building up my kingdom at the back of it. Then, face to face with France, and as powerful as herself, like a neighbour treating on equal terms, I would have cried to her: It's I, Arsène Lupin. Behold the former swindler and gentleman burglar, the Sultan of Adrar, the Sultan of Iguidi, the Sultan of El Djouf, the Sultan of the Tuaregs, the Sultan of Obata, the Sultan of Brakna and Frerzon. All these am I, the Sultan of Sultans, grandson of Mahomet, son of Allah. I, Arsène Lupin. And before taking the little grain of poison that sets one free, for a man like Arsène Lupin has no right to grow old, I should have signed the treaty of peace, the deed of gift in which I bestowed a kingdom on France, signed it, below the flourishes of my grand dignitaries, cades, pashas, and marabouts, with my lawful signature, the signature to which I am fully entitled, which I conquered at the point of my sword and by my all powerful will: Arsène I, Emperor of Mauritania. Don Luis uttered all these words in a strong voice, but without emphasis, with the very simple emotion and pride of a man who has done much and who knows the value of what he has done. There were but two ways of replying to him: by a shrug of the shoulders, as one replies to a madman, or by the silence that expresses reflection and approval. The Prime Minister and the Prefect of Police said nothing, but their looks betrayed their secret thoughts; and deep down within themselves they felt that they were in the presence of an absolutely exceptional specimen of mankind, created to perform immoderate actions and fashioned by his own hand for a superhuman destiny. Don Luis continued: "It was a fine curtain, was it not, Monsieur le Président du Conseil? And the end was worthy of the work. I should have been happy to have had it so. Arsène Lupin, dying on a throne, sceptre in hand, would have been a spectacle not devoid of glamour. Arsène Lupin dying with his title of Arsène I, Emperor of Mauritania and benefactor of France. What an apotheosis! The gods have willed it otherwise. Jealous, no doubt, they are lowering me to the level of my cousins of the Old World and turning me into that absurd creature, a king in exile. Their will be done. Peace to the late Emperor of Mauritania. He has strutted and fretted his hour upon the stage. Arsène I is dead. Long live France! Monsieur le Président du Conseil, I repeat my offer. Florence Levasseur is in danger. I alone can rescue her from the monster who is carrying her away. It will take me 24 hours. In return for 24 hours' liberty, I will give you the Mauritanian Empire. Do you accept, Monsieur le Président du Conseil?" "Well, certainly, I accept," said Valenglay, laughing. "What do you say, my dear Desmalions? The whole thing may not be very orthodox, but, hang it, Paris is worth a mass and the kingdom of Mauritania is a tempting morsel. We'll risk the experiment." Don Luis's face expressed so sincere a joy that one might have thought that he had just achieved the most brilliant victory, instead of sacrificing a crown and flinging into the gutter the most fantastic dream that mortal man had ever conceived and realized. He asked: "What guarantees do you require, Monsieur le Président?" "None. I can show you treaties, documents to prove " "Don't trouble. We'll talk all about that to morrow. Meanwhile, go ahead. You are free." The essential word, the incredible word, was spoken. Don Luis took a few steps toward the door. "One word more, Monsieur le Président," he said, stopping. "Among my former companions is one for whom I have procured a post suited to his inclinations and his deserts. This man I did not send for to come to Africa, thinking that some day or other he might be of use to me through the position which he occupied. I am speaking of Mazeroux, a sergeant in the detective service." "Sergeant Mazeroux, whom Caceres denounced, with corroborating evidence, as an accomplice of Arsène Lupin, is in prison." "Sergeant Mazeroux is a model of professional honour, Monsieur le Président. I owed his assistance only to the fact that I was helping the police. I was accepted as an auxiliary and more or less patronized by Monsieur le Préfet. Mazeroux thwarted me in anything I tried to do that was at all illegal. And he would have been the first to take me by the collar if he had been so instructed. I ask for his release." "Oh! Monsieur le Président, your consent will be an act of justice and I beg you to grant it. Sergeant Mazeroux shall leave France. He can be charged by the government with a secret mission in the south of Morocco, with the rank of colonial inspector." "Agreed," said Valenglay, laughing heartily. And he added: "My dear Préfet, once we depart from the strictly lawful path, there's no saying where we come to. But the end justifies the means; and the end which we have in view is to have done with this loathsome Mornington case." "This evening everything will be settled," said Don Luis. "I hope so. Our men are on the track." "They are on the track, but they have to check that track at every town, at every village, by inquiries made of every peasant they meet. They have to find out if the motor has not branched off somewhere. And they are wasting time. I shall go straight for the scoundrel." "By what miracle?" "That must be my secret for the present, Monsieur le Président." "Very well. Is there anything you want?" "This map of France." "Take it." "And a couple of revolvers." "Monsieur le Préfet will be good enough to ask his inspectors for 2 revolvers and to give them to you. Is that all? Any money?" "No, thank you, Monsieur le Président. I always carry a useful 50,000 francs in my pocketbook, in case of need." "In that case," said the Prefect of Police, "I shall have to send some one with you to the lockup. I presume your pocketbook was among the things taken from you." Don Luis smiled. "Monsieur le Préfet, the things that people can take from me are never of the least importance. My pocketbook is at the lockup, as you say, but the money—" He raised his left leg, took his boot in his hands and gave a slight twist to the heel. There was a little click, and a sort of double drawer shot out of the front of the sole. It contained 2 sheafs of banknotes and a number of diminutive articles, such as a gimlet, a watch spring, and some pills. "The wherewithal to escape," he said, "to live and to die. Good bye, Monsieur le Président." In the hall, M. Desmalions told the inspectors to let their prisoner go free. Don Luis asked: "Monsieur le Préfet, did Deputy Chief Weber give you any particulars about the brute's car?" "Yes, he telephoned from Versailles. It's a deep yellow car, belonging to the Compagnie des Comètes. The driver's seat is on the left. He's wearing a grey cloth cap with a black leather peak." "Thank you, Monsieur le Préfet." And he left the house. An inconceivable thing had happened. Don Luis was free. Half an hour's conversation had given him the power of acting and of fighting the decisive battle. He went off at a run. At the Trocadero he jumped into a taxi. "Go to Issy-les-Moulineaux," he cried. "Full speed, 40 francs." The cab flew through Passy, crossed the Seine, and reached the Issy-les-Moulineaux aviation ground in 10 minutes. None of the aeroplanes was out, for there was a stiff breeze blowing. Don Luis ran to the sheds. The owners' names were written over the doors. "Davanne," he muttered. "That's the man I want." The door of the shed was open. A short, stoutish man with a long red face was smoking a cigarette and watching some mechanics working at a monoplane. The little man was Davanne himself, the famous airman. Don Luis took him aside and, knowing from the papers the sort of man that he was, opened the conversation so as to surprise him from the start. "Monsieur," he said, unfolding his map of France, "I want to catch up some one who has carried off the woman I love and is making for Nantes by motor. The abduction took place at midnight. It is now about 8 o'clock. Suppose that the motor, which is just a hired taxi with a driver who has no inducement to break his neck, does an average of 20 miles an hour, including stoppages. In 12 hours' time, that is to say, at 12 o'clock, our man will have covered 240 miles and reached a spot between Angers and Nantes, at this point on the map." "Les Ponts de Drive," agreed Davanne, who was quietly listening. "Very well. Suppose, on the other hand, that an aeroplane were to start from Issy-les-Moulineaux at 8 o'clock in the morning and travel at the rate of 60 miles an hour, without stopping. In 4 hours' time, that is to say, at 12 o'clock, it would reach Les Ponts de Drive at the exact same moment as the motor. Am I right?" "Perfectly." "In that case, if we agree, all is well. Does your machine carry a passenger?" "Sometimes she does." "We'll start at once. What are your terms?" "It depends. Who are you?" "Arsène Lupin." "The devil you are!" exclaimed Davanne, a little taken aback. "I am Arsène Lupin. You must know the best part of what has happened from reading about it in the papers. Well, Florence Levasseur was kidnapped last night. I want to save her. What's your price?" "Nothing." "That's too much." "Perhaps, but the adventure amuses me. It will be an advertisement." "Very well. But your silence is necessary until to morrow. I'll buy it. Here's 20,000 francs." 10 minutes later, Don Luis was dressed in an airman's suit, cap and goggles; and an aeroplane rose to a height of 2,500 feet to avoid the air currents, flew above the Seine, and darted due west across France. Versailles, Maintenon, Chartres. Don Luis had never been up in an aeroplane. France had achieved the conquest of the air while he was fighting with the Legion and in the plains of the Sahara. Nevertheless, sensitive though he was to new impressions, and what more exciting impression could he have than this? He did not experience the heavenly delight of the man who for the first time soars above the earth. What monopolized his thoughts, strained his nerves, and excited his whole being to an exquisite degree was the as yet impossible but inevitable sight of the motor which they were pursuing. Amid the tremendous swarm of things beneath them, amid the unexpected din of the wings and the engine, in the immensity of the sky, in the infinity of the horizon, his eyes sought nothing but that, and his ears admitted no other sound than the hum of the invisible car. His were the mighty and brutal sensations of the hunter chasing his game. He was the bird of prey whom the distraught quarry has no chance of escaping. Nogent-le-Rotrou, La Ferté-Bernard, Le Mans. The two companions did not exchange a single word. Before him Perenna saw Davanne's broad back and powerful neck and shoulders. But by bending his head a little he saw the boundless space beneath him, and nothing interested him but the white ribbon of road that ran from town to town and from village to village, at times quite straight, as though a hand had stretched it, and at others lazily winding, broken by a river or a church. On this ribbon, at some place always closer and closer, were Florence and her abductor. He never doubted it. The yellow taxi was continuing its patient and plucky little effort. Mile after mile, through plains and villages, fields and forests, it was making Angers, with Les Ponts de Drive after, and right at the end of the ribbon the unattainable goal, Nantes, Saint-Nazaire, the steamer ready to start, and victory for the scoundrel. He laughed at the idea, as if there could be a question of any victory but his, the victory of the falcon over its prey, the victory of the flying bird over the game that runs afoot. Not for a second did he entertain the thought that the enemy might have slunk away by taking another road. There are some certainties that are equivalent to facts, and this one was so great that it seemed to him that his adversaries were obliged to comply with it. The car was travelling along the road to Nantes. It would cover an average of 20 miles an hour, and as he himself was travelling at the rate of 60 miles, the encounter would take place at the spot named, Les Ponts de Drive, and at the hour named, 12 o'clock. A cluster of houses, a huge castle, towers, steeples. Angers. Don Luis asked Davanne the time. It was 10 minutes to 12. Already Angers was a vanished vision. Once more the open country, broken up with many coloured fields. Through it all a road. And on that road a yellow motor. The yellow motor! The brute's motor! The motor with Florence Levasseur! Don Luis's joy contained no surprise. He knew so well that this was bound to happen. Davanne turned round and cried: "That's the one, isn't it? Yes, go straight for them." The airship dipped through space and caught up the car almost at once. Then Davanne slowed his engine and kept at 600 feet above the car and a little way behind. From here they made out all the details. The driver was seated on the left. He wore a grey cap with a black peak. It was one of the deep yellow taxis of the Compagnie des Comètes. It was the taxi which they were pursuing, and Florence was inside with her abductor. "At last," thought Don Luis, "I have them." They flew for some time, keeping the same distance. Davanne waited for a signal which Don Luis was in no hurry to give. He was revelling in the sensation of his power, with a force made up of mingled pride, hatred, and cruelty. He was indeed the eagle hovering overhead with its talons itching to rend live flesh. Escaped from the cage in which he had been imprisoned, released from the bonds that fastened him, he had come all the way at full flight, and was ready to swoop upon the helpless prey. He lifted himself in his seat and gave Davanne his instructions. "Be careful," he said, "not to brush too close by them. They might put a bullet into us." Another minute passed. Suddenly they saw that, half a mile ahead, the road divided into three, thus forming a very wide open space which was still further extended by two triangular patches of grass where the three roads met. "Now?" asked Davanne, turning to Don Luis. The surrounding country was deserted. "Off you go!" cried Don Luis. The airplane seemed to shoot down suddenly, as though driven by an irresistible force, which sent it flying like an arrow toward the mark. It passed at 300 feet above the car, and then all at once, checking its career, choosing the spot at which it meant to hit the target, calmly, silently, like a night bird, steering clear of the trees and signposts, it alighted softly on the grass of the crossroads. Don Luis sprang out and ran toward the motor, which was coming along at a rapid pace. He stood in the middle of the road, levelled his two revolvers, and shouted: "Stop or I fire!" The terrified driver put on both brakes. The car pulled up. Don Luis rushed to one of the doors. "Thunder!" he roared, discharging one of his revolvers for no reason and smashing a window pane. There was no one in the car. Chapter 18. Chapter 19, Part 1 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 19. The snare is laid. Beware, Lupin. The power that had impelled Don Luis to battle and victory was so intense that it suffered, so to speak, no cheek. Disappointment, rage, humiliation, torture were all swallowed up in an immediate desire for action and information, together with a longing to continue the chase. The rest was but an incident of no importance, which would soon be very simply explained. The petrified taxi driver was gazing wildly at the peasants coming from the distant farms, attracted by the sound of the aeroplane. Don Luis took him by the throat and put the barrel of his revolver to the man's temple. "Tell me what you know, or you're a dead man." And when the unhappy wretch began to stammer out entreaties: "It's no use moaning, no use hoping for assistance. Those people won't get here in time. So there's only one way of saving yourself. Speak. Last night a gentleman came to Versailles from Paris in a taxi, left it and took yours. Is that it?" "Yes." "The gentleman had a lady with him?" "Yes." "And he engaged you to take him to Nantes?" "Yes." "But he changed his mind on the way and told you to put him down?" "Yes." "Where?" "Before we got to Mans, in a little road on the right, with a sort of coach house, looking like a shed, 100 yards down it. They both got out there." "And you went on?" "He paid me to." "How much?" 500 francs. And there was another fare waiting at Nantes that I was to pick up and bring back to Paris for 1,000 francs more." "Do you believe in that other fare?" "No, I think he wanted to put people off the scent by sending them after me to Nantes while he branched off. Still, I had my money." "And when you left them, weren't you curious to see what happened?" "No." "Take care, a movement of my finger and I blow out your brains. Speak." "Well, yes, then. I went back on foot behind a bank covered with trees. The man had opened the coach house and was starting a small limousine car. The lady did not want to get in. They argued pretty fiercely. He threatened and begged by turns. But I could not hear what they said. She seemed very tired. He gave her a glass of water, which he drew from a tap in the wall. Then she consented. He closed the door on her and took his seat at the wheel." "A glass of water!" cried Don Luis. "Are you sure he put nothing else into the glass?" The driver seemed surprised at the question and then answered: "Yes, I think he did. He took something from his pocket." "Without the lady's knowledge?" "Yes, she didn't see." Don Luis mastered his horror. After all, it was impossible that the villain had poisoned Florence in that way, at that place, without anything to warrant so great a hurry. No, it was more likely that he had employed a narcotic, a drug of some sort which would dull Florence's brain, and make her incapable of noticing by what new roads and through what towns he was taking her. "And then," he repeated, "she decided to step in?" "Yes, and he shut the door and got into the driver's seat. I went away then." "Before knowing which direction they took?" "Yes." "Did you suspect on the way that they thought that they were being followed?" "Certainly. He did nothing but put his head out of the window." "Did the lady cry out at all?" "No." "Would you know him again if you saw him?" "No, I'm sure I shouldn't. At Versailles it was dark, and this morning I was too far away. Besides, it's curious, but the first time he struck me as very tall, and this morning, on the contrary, he looked quite a short man, as though bent in two. I can't understand it at all." Don Luis reflected. It seemed to him that he had asked all the necessary questions. Moreover, a gig drawn by a quick trotting horse was approaching the cross roads. There were two others behind it; and the groups of peasants were now quite near. He must finish the business. He said to the chauffeur: "I can see by your face that you intend to talk about me. Don't do that, my man. It would be foolish of you. Here's a 1,000-franc note for you. Only, if you blab, I'll make you repent it. That's all I have to say to you." He turned to Davanne, whose machine was beginning to block the traffic, and asked: "Can we start?" "Whenever you like. Where are we going?" Paying no attention to the movements of the people coming from every side, Don Luis unfolded his map of France and spread it out before him. He experienced a few seconds of anxiety at seeing the complicated tangle of roads and picturing the infinite number of places to which the villain might carry Florence. But he pulled himself together. He did not allow himself to hesitate. He refused even to reflect. He was determined to find out, and to find out everything at once, without clues, without useless consideration, simply by the marvellous intuition which invariably guided him at any crisis in his life. And his self-respect also required that he should give Davanne his answer without delay, and that the disappearance of those whom he was pursuing should not seem to embarrass him. With his eyes glued to the map, he placed one finger on Paris and another on Le Mans, and even before he had asked himself why the scoundrel had chosen that Paris, Le Mans, Angers route, he knew the answer to the question. The name of a town had struck him and made the truth appear like a flash of lightning: Alençon. Then and there, by the light of his memory, he penetrated the mystery. He repeated: "Where are we going?" "Back again, bearing to the left." "Any particular place?" "Alençon." "All right," said Davanne. "Lend a hand, some of you. I can make an easy start from that field just there." Don Luis and a few others helped him, and the preparations were soon made. Davanne tested his engine. Everything was in perfect order. At that moment a powerful racing car, with a siren yelling like a vicious animal, came tearing along the Angers road and promptly stopped. 3 men got out and rushed up to the driver of the yellow taxicab. Don Luis recognized them. They were Weber, the deputy chief, and the men who had taken him to the lock-up the night before, sent by the Prefect of Police to follow up the scoundrel's tracks. They had a brief interchange of words with the cab driver, which seemed to put them out, and they kept on gesticulating and plying him with fresh questions while looking at their watches and consulting their road maps. Don Luis went up to them. He was unrecognizable, with his head wrapped in his aviation cap and his face concealed by his goggles. Changing his voice: "The birds have flown, Mr. Deputy Chief," he said. Weber looked at him in utter amazement. Don Luis grinned. "Yes, flown. Our friend from the Ile Saint Louis is an artful dodger, you know. My lord's in his third motor. After the yellow car of which you heard at Versailles last night, he took another at Le Mans, destination unknown." The deputy chief opened his eyes in amazement. Who was this person who was mentioning facts that had been telephoned to police headquarters only at 2 o'clock that morning? He gasped: "But who are you, monsieur?" "What? Don't know me? What's the good of making appointments with people? You strain every nerve to be punctual, and then they ask you who you are. Come, Weber, confess that you're doing it to annoy me. Must you gaze on my features in broad daylight? Here goes." He raised his mask. "Arsène Lupin!" spluttered the detective. "At your service, young fellow. On foot, in the saddle, and in mid air. That's where I'm going now. Good bye." And so great was Weber's astonishment at seeing Arsène Lupin, whom he had taken to the lock-up 12 hours before, standing in front of him, free, at 240 miles from Paris, that Don Luis, as he went back to Davanne, thought: "What a crusher! I've knocked him out in one round. There's no hurry. The referee will count 10 at least 3 times before Weber can say 'Mother.'" Davanne was ready. Don Luis climbed into the monoplane. The peasants pushed at the wheels. The machine started. "North northeast," Don Luis ordered. 90 miles an hour, 10,000 francs. "We've the wind against us," said Davanne. 5,000 francs extra for the wind," shouted Don Luis. He admitted no obstacle in his haste to reach Damigny. He now understood the whole thing, and, harking back to the very beginning, he was surprised that his mind had never perceived the connection between the 2 skeletons hanging in the barn and the series of crimes resulting from the Mornington inheritance. Stranger still, how was it that the almost certain murder of Langernault, Hippolyte Fauville's old friend, had not afforded him all the clues which it contained? The crux of the sinister plot lay in that. Who could have intercepted, on Fauville's behalf, the letters of accusation which Fauville was supposed to write to his old friend Langernault, except someone in the village, or someone who had lived in the village? And now everything was clear. It was the nameless scoundrel who had started his career of crime by killing old Langernault and then the de Dessus-la-Mer couple. The method was the same as later on. It was not direct murder, but anonymous murder, murder by suggestion. Like Mornington the American, like Fauville the engineer, like Marie, like Gaston Sauverand, old Langernault had been craftily done away with, and the de Dessus-la-Mer couple driven to commit suicide in the barn. It was from there that the tiger had come to Paris, where later he was to find Fauville and Cosmo Mornington and plot the tragic affair of the inheritance. And it was there that he was now returning. There was no doubt about that. To begin with, the fact that he had administered a narcotic to Florence constituted an indisputable proof. Was he not obliged to put Florence to sleep in order to prevent her from recognizing the landscape at Alençon and Damigny, or the old castle which she had explored with Gaston Sauverand? On the other hand, the Le Mans Angers Nantes route, which had been taken to put the police on a false track, meant only an extra hour or 2 at most for any one motoring to Alençon. Lastly, that coach house near a big town, that limousine waiting, ready charged with petrol, showed that the villain, when he intended to visit his retreat, took the precaution of stopping at Le Mans in order to go from there in his limousine to Langernault's deserted estate. He would therefore reach his lair at 10 o'clock that morning, and he would arrive there with Florence Levasseur dead asleep. The question forced itself upon him, the terrible, persistent question: what did he mean to do with Florence Levasseur? "Faster! Faster!" cried Don Luis. Now that he knew the scoundrel's haunt, the man's scheme became hideously evident to him. Feeling himself hunted down, lost, an object of hatred and terror to Florence, whose eyes were now open to the true state of things, what plan could he have in mind except his invariable plan of murder? "Faster!" cried Don Luis. "We're making no headway. Go faster, can't you?" Florence murdered! Perhaps the crime was not yet accomplished. No, it could not be. Killing takes time. It is preceded by words, by the offer of a bargain, by threats, by entreaties, by a wholly unspeakable scene. But the thing was being prepared. Florence was going to die. Florence was going to die by the hand of the brute who loved her. For he loved her, Don Luis had an intuition of that monstrous love. And he was bound to believe that such a love could only end in torture and bloodshed. Sablé, Sillé-le-Guillaume. The earth sped beneath them. The trees and houses glided by like shadows. And then Alençon. It was hardly more than 1:45 when they landed in a meadow between the town and Damigny. Don Luis made inquiries. A number of motor cars had passed along the road to Damigny, including a small limousine driven by a gentleman who had turned down a cross road; and this cross road led to the woods at the back of Langernault's estate, the old castle. Don Luis's conviction was so firm that, after taking leave of Devanne, he helped him to start on his homeward flight. He had no further need of him. He needed nobody. The final duel was at hand. He ran along, guided by the tracks of the tyres in the dust, and followed the cross road. To his great surprise, this road went nowhere near the wall behind the barn from which he had jumped a few weeks before. After clearing the woods, Don Luis came out into a large untilled space where the road turned back toward the estate and ended at an old 2-winged gate protected with iron sheets and bars. The limousine had gone in that way. "And I must get in this way too," thought Don Luis. "I must get in at all costs and immediately, without wasting time in looking for an opening or a handy tree." Now the wall was 13 feet high at this spot. Don Luis got in. How he managed it, by what superhuman effort, he himself could not have said after he had done it. Somehow or other, by hanging on to invisible projections, by digging a knife which he had borrowed from Devanne into the interstices between the stones, he managed it. And when he was on the other side, he discovered the tracks of the tyres running to the left, toward a part of the grounds which he did not know, more undulating than the other and broken up with little hills and ruined buildings covered with thick curtains of ivy. Deserted though the rest of the park was, this portion seemed much more uncivilized, in spite of the ragged remains of box and laurel hedges that stood here and there amidst the nettles and brambles, and the luxuriant swarm of tall wildflowers, valerian, mullein, hemlock, foxglove and angelica. Suddenly, on turning the corner of an old hedge of clipped yews, Don Luis saw the limousine, which had been left, or rather hidden there in a hollow. The door was open. The disorder of the inside of the car, the rug hanging over the footboard, a broken window, a cushion on the floor, all bore witness to a struggle. The scoundrel had no doubt taken advantage of the fact that Florence was asleep to tie her up; and on arriving, when he tried to take her out of the car, Florence must have clutched at everything that offered. Don Luis at once verified the correctness of his theory. As he went along the very narrow, grass-grown path that led up the slope, he saw that the grass was uniformly pressed down. "Oh, the villain!" he thought. "The villain! He doesn't carry his victim, he drags her." If he had listened only to his instinct, he would have rushed to Florence's rescue. But his profound sense of what to do and what to avoid saved him from committing any such imprudence. At the first alarm, at the least sound, the tiger would have throttled his prey. To escape this hideous catastrophe, Don Luis must take him by surprise, and then and there deprive him of his power of action. He controlled himself, therefore, and slowly and cautiously mounted the incline. The path ran upward between heaps of stones and fallen buildings, and among clumps of shrubs overtopped by beeches and oaks. The place was evidently the site of the old feudal castle which had given the estate its name. And it was here, near the top, that the scoundrel had selected one of his retreats. The trail continued over the trampled herbage, and Don Luis even caught sight of something shining on the ground in a tuft of grass. It was a ring, a tiny and very simple ring, consisting of a gold circlet and 2 small pearls, which he had often noticed on Florence's finger. And the fact that caught his attention was that a blade of grass passed and repassed and passed a third time through the inside of the ring, like a ribbon that had been rolled round it deliberately. "It's a clear signal," said Perenna to himself. "The villain probably stopped here to rest, and Florence, bound up, but with her fingers free, was able to leave this evidence of her passage." So the girl still hoped. She expected assistance; and Don Luis reflected with emotion that it was perhaps to him that this last desperate appeal was addressed. 50 steps farther, and this detail pointed to the rather curious fatigue experienced by the scoundrel. There was a second halt and a second clue, a flower, a field sage, which the poor little hand had picked and plucked of its petals. Next came the print of the 5 fingers dug into the ground, and next a cross drawn with a pebble. And in this way he was able to follow, minute by minute, all the successive stages of the horrible journey. The last stopping place was near. The climb became steeper and rougher. The fallen stones occasioned more frequent obstacles. On the right, the Gothic arches, the remains of a chapel, stood out against the blue sky. On the left was a strip of wall with a mantelpiece still clinging to it. 20 steps farther Don Luis stopped. He seemed to hear something. He listened. He was not mistaken. The sound was repeated, and it was the sound of laughter. But such an awful laugh! A strident laugh, evil as the laughter of a devil, and so shrill! It was more like the laugh of a woman, of a mad woman. Again silence. Then another noise, the noise of an implement striking the ground. Then silence again. Chapter 19. Chapter 19, Part 2 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 19. The Snare is Laid. Beware, Lupin. And this was happening at a distance which Don Luis estimated at 100 yards. The path ended in 3 steps cut in the earth. At the top was a fairly large plateau, also encumbered with rubbish and ruins. In the centre, opposite Don Luis, stood a screen of immense laurels planted in a semicircle. The marks of trodden grass led up to it. Don Luis was a little surprised, for the screen presented an impenetrable outline. He walked on and found that there had once been a cutting, and that the branches had ended by meeting again. They were easy to push aside, and it was through here that the scoundrel must have passed. To all appearances he was there now, at the end of his journey, not far away, occupied in some sinister task. Indeed, the air was rent by a chuckle, so close by that Don Luis gave a start, and felt as if the scoundrel were laughing beforehand at his intervention. He remembered the letter with the words written in red ink: "There's still time, Lupin. Retire from the contest. If not, it means your death too. When you think that your object is attained, when your hand is raised against me and you utter words of triumph, at the same moment the ground will open beneath your feet. The place of your death is chosen. The snare is laid. Beware, Lupin." The whole letter passed through his brain, with its formidable threat, and he felt a shiver of fear. But no fear could stay the man that he was. He had already taken hold of the branches with his hands and was clearing a way for himself. He stopped. A last bulwark of leaves hid him from sight. He pulled some of them aside at the level of his eyes. And he saw. First of all, he saw Florence, alone at this moment, lying on the ground, bound, at 30 yards in front of him. And he at once perceived, to his intense delight, from certain movements of her head, that she was still alive. He had come in time. Florence was not dead. She would not die. That was a certainty against which nothing could prevail. Florence would not die. Then he examined the things around. To the right and left of where he stood, the screen of laurels curved and embraced a sort of arena in which, among yews that had once been clipped into cones, lay capitals, columns, broken pieces of arches and vaults, obviously placed there to adorn the formal garden that had been laid out on the ruins of the ancient donjon keep. In the middle was a small circular space reached by 2 narrow paths, one of which presented the same traces of trodden grass and was a continuation of that by which Don Luis had come, while the other intersected the first at right angles and joined the 2 ends of the screen of shrubs. Opposite was a confused heap of broken stones and natural rocks, cemented with clay, bound together by the roots of gnarled trees, the whole forming at the back of the picture a small, shallow grotto, full of crevices that admitted the light. The floor, which Don Luis could easily distinguish, consisted of 3 or 4 flagstones. Florence Levasseur lay inside this grotto, bound hand and foot, looking like the victim of some mysterious sacrifice about to be performed on the altar of the grotto, in the amphitheatre of this old garden closed by the wall of tall laurels and overlooked by a pile of ancestral ruins. In spite of the distance, Don Luis was able to make out every detail of her pale face. Though convulsed with anguish, it still retained a certain serenity, an expression of waiting, and even of expectancy, as if Florence, believing until the last moment in the possibility of a miracle, had not yet relinquished all hope of life. Nevertheless, though she was not gagged, she did not call for help. Perhaps she thought that it was useless, and that the road which she had strewn with the marks of her passing was more likely to bring assistance to her side than cries, which the villain would soon have stifled. Strange to say, it seemed to Don Luis as if the girl's eyes were obstinately fixed on the very spot where he was hiding. Possibly she suspected his presence. Possibly she foresaw his help. Suddenly Don Luis clutched one of his revolvers and half raised his arm, ready to take aim. The sacrificer, the butcher, had just appeared, not far from the altar on which the victim lay. He came from between 2 rocks, of which a bush marked the intervening space, which apparently afforded but a very low outlet, for he still walked as though bent double, with his head bowed and his long arms swinging so low as to touch the ground. He went to the grotto and gave his horrible chuckle.
"You're still there, I see," he said. "No sign of the rescuer. Perseus is a little late, I fear. He'd better hurry."
The tone of his voice was so shrill that Don Luis heard every word, and so odd, so unhuman, that it gave him a feeling of physical discomfort. He gripped his revolver tightly, prepared to shoot at the first suspicious movement.
"He'd better hurry," repeated the scoundrel with a laugh. "If not, all will be over in 5 minutes. You see that I'm a man of method, eh, Florence, my darling?"
He picked up something from the ground. It was a stick shaped like a crutch. He put it under his left arm and, still bent in two, began to walk like a man who has not the strength to stand erect. Then suddenly, and with no apparent cause to explain his change of attitude, he drew himself up and used his crutch as he would a cane. He then walked round the outside of the grotto, making a careful inspection, the meaning of which escaped Don Luis for the time. He was of a good height in this position, and Don Luis easily understood why the driver of the yellow taxi, who had seen him under two such different aspects, was unable to say whether he was very tall or very short. But his legs, slack and unsteady, gave way beneath him as if any prolonged exertion were beyond his power. He relapsed into his first attitude. The man was a cripple, smitten with some disease that affected his powers of locomotion. He was excessively thin. Don Luis also saw his pallid face, his cavernous cheeks, his hollow temples, his skin the colour of parchment, the face of a sufferer from consumption, a bloodless face. When he had finished his inspection, he came up to Florence and said: "Though you've been very good, baby, and haven't screamed so far, we'd better take our precautions and remove any possibility of a surprise by giving you a nice little gag to wear, don't you think?" He stooped over her and wound a large handkerchief round the lower part of her face. Then, bending still farther down, he began to speak to her in a very low voice, talking almost into her ear. But wild bursts of laughter, horrible to hear, interrupted this whispering. Feeling the imminence of the danger, dreading some movement on the wretch's part, a sudden murderous attack, the prompt prick of a poisoned needle, Don Luis had levelled his revolver and, confident of his skill, waited events. What was happening over there? What were the words spoken? What infamous bargain was the villain proposing to Florence? At what shameful price could she obtain her release? The cripple stepped back angrily, shouting in furious accents: "But don't you understand that you are done for? Now that I have nothing more to fear, now that you have been silly enough to come with me and place yourself in my power, what hope have you left? To move me, perhaps? Is that it? Because I'm burning with passion, you imagine? Oh, you never made a greater mistake, my pet. I don't care a fig if you do die. Once dead, you cease to count. What else? Perhaps you consider that, being crippled, I shall not have the strength to kill you? But there's no question of my killing you, Florence. Have you ever known me kill people? Never. I'm much too big a coward. I should be frightened. I should shake all over. No, no, Florence, I shan't touch you. And yet... Here, look what's going to happen. See for yourself. I tell you the thing's managed in my own style, and whatever you do, don't be afraid. It's only a preliminary warning." He had moved away, and, helping himself with his hands, holding on to the branches of a tree, he climbed up the first layers of rock that formed the grotto on the right. Here he knelt down. There was a small pickaxe lying beside him. He took it and gave 3 blows to the nearest heap of stones. They came tumbling down in front of the grotto. Don Luis sprang from his hiding place with a roar of terror. He had suddenly realized the position. The grotto, the accumulation of boulders, the piles of granite, everything was so placed that its equilibrium could be shattered at any moment, and that Florence ran the risk of being buried under the rubbish. It was not a question, therefore, of slaying the villain, but of saving Florence on the spot. He was halfway across in 2 or 3 seconds, but here, in one of those mental flashes which are even quicker than the maddest rush, he became aware that the tracks of trampled grass did not cross the central circus, and that the scoundrel had gone round it. Why? That was one of the questions which instinct, ever suspicious, puts, but which reason has not the time to answer. Don Luis went straight ahead, and he had no sooner set foot on the place than the catastrophe occurred. It all happened with incredible suddenness, as though he had tried to walk on space and found himself hurled into it. The ground gave way beneath him, the clods of grass separated, and he fell. He fell down a hole which was none other than the mouth of a well 4 feet wide at most, the curb of which had been cut down level with the ground. Only this was what took place. As he was running very fast, his impetus flung him against the opposite wall in such a way that his forearms lay on the outer ledge and his hands were able to clutch at the roots of plants. So great was his strength that he might just have been able to drag himself up by his wrists. But responding to the attack, the scoundrel had at once hurried to meet his assailant, and was now standing at 10 paces from Don Luis, threatening him with his revolver.
"Don't move," he cried, "or I'll smash you."
Don Luis was thus reduced to helplessness, at the risk of receiving the enemy's fire. Their eyes met for a few seconds. The cripple's were burning with fever, like the eyes of a sick man. Crawling along, watching Don Luis's slightest movement, he came and squatted beside the well. The revolver was levelled in his outstretched hand, and his infernal chuckle rang out again.
Lupin, Lupin, that's done it. Lupin's dive. What a mug you must be. I warned you, you know. Warned you in blood-red ink. Remember my words. The place of your death is chosen. The snare is laid. Beware, Lupin. And here you are. So you're not in prison. You warded off that stroke, you rogue, you. Fortunately, I foresaw thence and took my precautions. What do you say to it? What do you think of my little scheme? I said to myself, all the police will come rushing at my heels, but there's only one who's capable of catching me, and that's Lupin. So we'll show him the way. We'll lead him on the leash all along a little path scraped clean by the victim's body. And then a few landmarks scattered here and there. First, the fair damsel's ring with a blade of grass twisted round it. Farther on, a flower without its petals. Farther on, the marks of 5 fingers in the ground. Next, the sign of the cross. No mistaking them, was there? Once you thought me fool enough to give Florence time to play hop-o'-my-thumb's game, it was bound to lead you straight to the mouth of the well, to the clods of turf which I dabbed across it last month, in anticipation of this windfall. Remember, the snare is laid, and a snare after my own style, Lupin. One of the best. Oh, I love getting rid of people with their kind assistance. We work together like friends and partners. You've caught the notion, haven't you? I don't do my own job. The others do it for me, hanging themselves or giving themselves careless injections, unless they prefer the mouth of a well, as you seem to do, Lupin. My poor old chap, what a sticky mess you're in. I never saw such a face. Never, on my word. Florence, do look at the expression on your swain's mobile features.
He broke off, seized with a fit of laughter that shook his outstretched arm, imparted the most savage look to his face, and set his legs jerking under his body like the legs of a dancing doll. His enemy was growing weaker before his eyes. Don Luis's fingers, which had first gripped the roots of the grass, were now vainly clutching the stones of the wall, and his shoulders were sinking lower and lower into the well.
"We've done it,"
spluttered the villain, in the midst of his convulsions of merriment.
"Lord, how good it is to laugh, especially when one so seldom does. Yes, I'm a wet blanket, I am, a first-rate man at a funeral. You've never seen me laugh, Florence, have you? But this time it's really too amusing. Lupin in his hole, and Florence in her grotto. One dancing a jig above the abyss, and the other at her last gasp under her mountain. What a sight! Come, Lupin, don't tire yourself. What's the use of those grimaces? You're not afraid of eternity, are you? A good man like you, the Don Quixote of modern times. Come, let yourself go. There's not even any water in the well to splash about in. No, it's just a nice little slide into infinity. You can't so much as hear the sound of a pebble when you drop it in. And just now I threw a piece of lighted paper down and lost sight of it in the dark. Brrr! It sent a cold shiver down my back. Come, be a man. It'll only take a moment, and you've been through worse than that. Good, you nearly did it then. You're making up your mind to it. I say, Lupin, Lupin, aren't you going to say good-bye? Not a smile? Not a word of thanks? Au revoir, Lupin. Au revoir. He ceased. He watched for the appalling end which he had so cleverly prepared, and of which all the events were following close on one another in accordance with his inflexible will. It did not take long. The shoulders had gone down, the chin, and then the mouth convulsed with the death grin, and then the eyes drunk with terror, and then the forehead, and the hair. The whole head, in short,
had disappeared. The cripple sat gazing wildly, as though in ecstasy, motionless, with an expression of fierce delight, and without a word that could trouble the silence and interrupt his hatred. At the edge of the abyss nothing remained but the hands, the obstinate, stubborn, desperate, heroic hands, the poor, helpless hands which alone still lived, and which, gradually, retreating toward death, yielded and fell back and let go. The hands had slipped. For a moment the fingers held on like claws. So natural was the effort which they made, that it looked as if they did not even yet despair, unaided, of resuscitating and bringing back to the light of day the corpse already entombed in the darkness. And then they in their turn gave way. And then suddenly there was nothing more to be seen, and nothing more to be heard. The cripple started to his feet, as though released by a spring, and yelled with delight,
"Oof! That's done it! Lupin in the bottomless pit! One more adventure finished! Woof!"
Turning in Florence's direction, he once more danced his dance of death. He raised himself to his full height, and then suddenly crouched down again, throwing about his legs like the grotesque, ragged limbs of a scarecrow. And he sang and whistled and belched forth insults and hideous blasphemies. Then he came back to the yawning mouth of the well, and, standing some way off, as if still afraid to come nearer, he spat into it 3 times. Nor was this enough for his hatred. There were some broken pieces of statuary on the ground. He took a carved head, rolled it along the grass, and sent it crashing down the well. A little farther away was a stack of old rusty cannon balls. These also he rolled to the edge and pushed in. 5, 10, 15 cannon balls went scooting down, one after the other, banging against the walls with a loud and sinister noise, which the echo swelled into the angry roar of distant thunder.
"There, take that, Lupin! I'm sick of you, you dirty cad! That's for the spokes you put in my wheel, over that damned inheritance. Here, take this, too. And this. And this. Here's a chocolate for you in case you're hungry. Do you want another? Here you are, old chap. Catch!"
He staggered, seized with a sort of giddiness, and had to squat on his haunches. He was utterly spent. However, obeying a last convulsion, he still found the strength to kneel down by the well, and, leaning over the darkness, he stammered breathlessly,
I say, corpse, don't go knocking at the gate of hell at once. The little girl's joining you in 20 minutes. Yes, that's it, at 4 o'clock. You know I'm a punctual man and keep my appointments to the minute. She'll be with you at 4 o'clock exactly. By the way, I was almost forgetting. The inheritance, you know, Mornington's 100 millions. Well, that's mine. Why, of course, you can't doubt that I took all my precautions. Florence will explain everything presently. It's very well thought out. You'll see. You'll see.
He could not get out another word. The last syllable sounded more like hiccoughs. The sweat poured from his hair and his forehead, and he sank to the ground, moaning like a dying man tortured by the last throes of death. He remained like that for some minutes, with his head in his hands, shivering all over his body. He appeared to be suffering everywhere, in each anguished muscle, in each sick nerve. Then, under the influence of a thought that seemed to make him act unconsciously, one of his hands crept spasmodically down his side, and groping, uttering hoarse cries of pain, he managed to take from his pocket and put to his lips a phial out of which he greedily drank 2 or 3 mouthfuls. He at once revived, as though he had swallowed warmth and strength. His eyes grew calmer, his mouth shaped itself into a horrible smile. He turned to Florence and said,
"Don't flatter yourself, pretty one. I'm not gone yet, and I've plenty of time to attend to you. And then, after that, there'll be no more worries, no more of that scheming and fighting that wears one out. A nice, quiet, uneventful life for me. With 100 millions one can afford to take life easy, eh, little girl? Come on, I'm feeling much better."
End of chapter 19. Chapter 20, Part 1 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 20. Florence's Secret. It was time for the second act of the tragedy. Don Luis Perenna's death was to be followed by that of Florence. Like some monstrous butcher, The cripple passed from one to the other with no more compassion than if he were dealing with the oxen in a slaughter-house. Still weak in his limbs, he dragged himself to where the girl lay, took a cigarette from a gun-metal case, and with a final touch of cruelty said:
"When this cigarette is quite burned out, Florence, it will be your turn. Keep your eyes on it. It represents the last minutes of your life, reduced to ashes. Keep your eyes on it, Florence, and think. I want you to understand this. All the owners of the estate, and old Langernault in particular, have always considered that the heap of rocks and stones overhanging your head was bound to fall to pieces sooner or later. And myself, for years, with untiring patience, believing in a favourable opportunity, have amused myself by making it crumble away still more, by undermining it with the rain-water, in short, by working at it in such a way that, upon my word, I can't make out how the thing keeps standing at all. Or rather, I do understand. The few strokes with the pickaxe which I gave it just now were merely intended for a warning. But I have only to give one more stroke in the right place, and knock out a little brick wedged in between two lumps of stone, for the whole thing to tumble to the ground like a house of cards." "A little brick, Florence," he chuckled. "A tiny little brick which chance placed there between two blocks of stone, and has kept it in position until now. Out comes the brick, down come the blocks, and there's your catastrophe."
He took a breath and continued:
After that, Florence, this. Either the smash will take place in such a way that your body will not even be in sight, if anyone should dream of coming here to look for you, or else it will be partly visible, in which case I shall at once cut and destroy the cords with which you are tied. What will the law think then? Simply that Florence Levasseur, a fugitive from justice, hid herself in a grotto which fell upon her and crushed her. That's all. A few prayers for the rash creature's soul, and not another word. As for me, when my work is done and my sweetheart dead, I shall pack my traps, carefully remove all the traces of my coming, smooth every inch of the trampled grass, jump into my motor-car, sham death for a little while, and then put in a sensational claim for the 100 millions.
He gave a little chuckle, took 2 or 3 puffs at his cigarette, and added calmly:
I shall claim the 100 millions, and I shall get them. That's the prettiest part of it. I shall claim them because I'm entitled to them, and I explained to you just now, before Master Lupin came interfering, how, from the moment that you were dead, I had the most undeniable legal right to them. And I shall get them, because it is physically impossible to bring up the least sort of proof against me.
He moved closer.
There's not a charge that can hurt me. Suspicions, yes, moral presumptions, clues, anything you like, but not a scrap of material evidence. Nobody knows me. One person has seen me as a tall man, another as a short man. My very name is unknown. All my murders have been committed anonymously. All my murders are more like suicides, or can be explained as suicides. I tell you, the law is powerless. With Lupin dead, and Florence Levasseur dead, there's no one to bear witness against me. Even if they arrest me, they would have to discharge me in the end for lack of evidence. I shall be branded, execrated, hated, and cursed. My name will stink in people's nostrils as if I were the greatest of malefactors. But I shall possess the 100 millions, and with that, pretty one, I shall possess the friendship of all decent men. I tell you again, with Lupin and you gone, it's all over. There's nothing left, nothing but some papers and a few little things which I've been weak enough to keep until now in this pocket-book here, and which would be enough and more than enough to cost me my head, if I did not intend to burn them in a few minutes, and send the ashes to the bottom of the well. So you see, Florence, all my measures are taken. You need not hope for compassion from me, nor for help from anywhere else, since no one knows where I have brought you, and Arsène Lupin is no longer alive. Under these conditions, Florence, make your choice. The ending is in your hands. Either you die, absolutely and irrevocably, or you accept my love.
There was a moment of silence, then:
Answer me, yes or no. A movement of your head will decide your fate. If it's no, you die. If it's yes, I shall release you. We will go from here, and later, when your innocence is proved, and I'll see to that, you shall become my wife. Is the answer yes, Florence?
He put the question to her with real anxiety and with a restrained passion that set his voice trembling. His knees dragged over the flagstones. He begged and threatened, hungering to be entreated, and at the same time almost eager for a refusal, so great was his natural murderous impulse.
"Is it yes, Florence? A nod, the least little nod, and I shall believe you implicitly, for you never lie, and your promise is sacred. Is it yes, Florence? Oh, Florence, answer me. It is madness to hesitate. Your life depends on a fresh outburst of my anger. Answer me. Here, look, my cigarette is out. I'm throwing it away, Florence. A sign of your head. Is the answer yes or no?"
He bent over her and shook her by the shoulders as if to force her to make the sign which he asked for. But suddenly seized with a sort of frenzy, he rose to his feet and exclaimed:
"She's crying! She's crying! She dares to weep! But, wretched girl, do you think that I don't know what you're crying for? I know your secret, pretty one, and I know that your tears do not come from any fear of dying. You? Why, you fear nothing. No, it's something else. Shall I tell you your secret? Oh, I can't, though the words scorch my lips. Oh, cursed woman, you've brought it on yourself. You yourself want to die, Florence, as you're crying. You yourself want to die."
While he was speaking, he hastened to get to work and prepare the horrible tragedy. The leather pocket-book which he had mentioned as containing the papers was lying on the ground. He put it in his pocket. Then, still trembling, he pulled off his jacket and threw it on the nearest bush. Next, he took up the pickaxe and climbed the lower stones, stamping with rage and shouting:
"It's you who have asked to die, Florence. Nothing can prevent it now. I can't even see your head if you make a sign. It's too late. You asked for it and you've got it. Ah, you're crying. You dare to cry. What madness!"
He was standing almost above the grotto, on the right. His anger made him draw himself to his full height. He looked horrible, hideous, atrocious. His eyes filled with blood as he inserted the bar of the pickaxe between the two blocks of granite, at the spot where the brick was wedged in. Then, standing on one side, in a place of safety, he struck the brick, struck it again. At the third stroke, the brick flew out. What happened was so sudden, the pyramid of stones and rubbish came crashing with such violence into the hollow of the grotto and in front of the grotto, that the cripple himself, in spite of his precautions, was dragged down by the avalanche and thrown upon the grass. It was not a serious fall, however, and he picked himself up at once, stammering: "Florence! Florence!" Though he had so carefully prepared the catastrophe and brought it about with such determination, its results seemed suddenly to stagger him. He hunted for the girl with terrified eyes. He stooped down and crawled round the chaos shrouded in clouds of dust. He looked through the interstices. He saw nothing. Florence was buried under the ruins, dead, invisible, as he had anticipated.
"Dead!"
he said with staring eyes and a look of stupor on his face.
"Dead! Florence is dead!"
Once again he lapsed into a state of absolute prostration, which gradually slackened his legs, brought him to the ground and paralyzed him. His two efforts, following so close upon each other and ending in disasters of which he had been the immediate witness, seemed to have robbed him of all his remaining energy. With no hatred in him, since Arsène Lupin no longer lived, with no love, since Florence was no more, he looked like a man who has lost his last motive for existence. Twice his lips uttered the name of Florence. Was he regretting his friend? Having reached the last of that appalling series of crimes, was he imagining the several stages, each marked with a corpse? Was something like a conscience making itself felt deep down in that brute? Or was it not rather the sort of physical torpor that numbs the sated beast of prey, glutted with flesh, drunk with blood, a torpor that is almost voluptuousness? Nevertheless, he once more repeated Florence's name, and tears rolled down his cheeks. He lay long in this condition, gloomy and motionless. And when, after again taking a few sips of his medicine, he went back to his work, he did so mechanically, with none of that gaiety which had made him hop on his legs and set about his murder as though he were going to a pleasure party. He began by returning to the bush from which Lupin had seen him emerge. Behind this bush, between two trees, was a shelter containing tools and arms, spades, rakes, guns, and rolls of wire and rope. Making several journeys, he carried them to the well, intending to throw them down it before he went away. He next examined every particle of the little mound up which he had climbed, in order to make sure that he was not leaving the least trace of his passage. He made a similar examination of those parts of the lawn on which he had stepped, except the path leading to the well, the inspection of which he kept for the last. He brushed up the trodden grass and carefully smoothed the trampled earth. He was obviously anxious, and seemed to be thinking of other things, while at the same time mechanically doing those things which a murderer knows by force of habit that it is wise to do. One little incident seemed to awake him up. A wounded swallow fell to the ground close by where he stood. He stooped, caught it, and crushed it in his hands, kneading it like a scrap of crumpled paper; and his eyes shone with a savage delight as he gazed at the blood that trickled from the poor bird and reddened his hands. But when he flung the shapeless little body into a furze bush, he saw on the spikes in the bush a hair, a long, fair hair, and all his depression returned at the memory of Florence. He knelt in front of the ruined grotto. Then, breaking 2 sticks of wood, he placed the pieces in the form of a cross under one of the stones. As he was bending over, a little looking-glass slipped from his waistcoat pocket, and, striking a pebble, broke. This sign of ill luck made a great impression on him. He cast a suspicious look around him, and, shivering with nervousness, as though he felt threatened by the invisible powers, he muttered: I'm afraid. Let's go away." His watch now marked 4:30. He took his jacket from the shrub on which he had hung it, slipped his arms into the sleeves, and put his hand in the right-hand outside pocket, where he had placed the pocket-book containing his papers. "Hullo!" he said in great surprise. "I was sure I had—" He felt in the left outside pocket, then in the handkerchief pocket, then, with feverish excitement, in both the inside pockets. The pocket-book was not there, and, to his extreme amazement, all the other things which he was absolutely certain that he had left in the pockets of his jacket were gone: his cigarette-case, his box of matches, his note-book. He was flabbergasted. His features became distorted. He spluttered incomprehensible words, while the most terrible thought took hold of his mind so forcibly as to become a reality. There was someone within the precincts of the old castle. There was someone within the precincts of the old castle. And this someone was now hiding near the ruins, in the ruins, perhaps. And this someone had seen him. And this someone had witnessed the death of Arsène Lupin and the death of Florence Levasseur. And this someone, taking advantage of his heedlessness, and knowing from his words that the papers existed, had searched his jacket and rifled the pockets. His eyes expressed the alarm of a man accustomed to work in the darkness unperceived, and who suddenly becomes aware that another's eyes have surprised him at his hateful task, and that he is being watched in every movement for the first time in his life. Whence did that look come that troubled him as the daylight troubles a bird of the night? Was it an intruder hiding there by accident, or an enemy bent upon his destruction? Was it an accomplice of Arsène Lupin, a friend of Florence, one of the police? And was this adversary satisfied with his stolen booty, or was he preparing to attack him? The cripple dared not stir. He was there, exposed to assault, on open ground, with nothing to protect him against the blows that might come before he even knew where the adversary was. At last, however, the imminence of the danger gave him back some of his strength. Still motionless, he inspected his surroundings with an attention so keen that it seemed as if no detail could escape him. He would have sighted the most indistinct shape among the stones of the ruined pile, or in the bushes, or behind the tall laurel screen. Seeing nobody, he came along, supporting himself on his crutch. He walked without the least sound of his feet or of the crutch, which probably had a rubber shoe at the end of it. His raised right hand held a revolver. His finger was on the trigger. The least effort of his will, or even less than that, a spontaneous injunction of his instinct, was enough to put a bullet into the enemy. He turned to the left. On this side, between the extreme end of the laurels and the first fallen rocks, there was a little brick path which was more likely the top of a buried wall. The cripple followed this path, by which the enemy might have reached the shrub on which the jacket hung without leaving any traces. The last branches of the laurels were in his way, and he pushed them aside. There was a tangled mess of bushes. To avoid this, he skirted the foot of the mound, after which he took a few more steps, going round a huge rock. And then, suddenly, he started back and almost lost his balance, while his crutch fell to the ground and his revolver slipped from his hand. What he had seen, what he saw, was certainly the most terrifying sight that he could possibly have beheld. Opposite him, at 10 paces distance, with his hands in his pockets, his feet crossed, and one shoulder resting lightly against the rocky wall, stood not a man. It was not a man and could not be a man, for this man, as the cripple knew, was dead, had died the death from which there is no recovery. It was therefore a ghost, and this apparition from the tomb raised the cripple's terror to its highest pitch. He shivered, seized with a fresh attack of fever and weakness. His dilated pupils stared at the extraordinary phenomenon. His whole being, filled with demoniacal superstition and dread, crumpled up under the vision to which each second lent an added horror. Incapable of flight, incapable of defence, he dropped upon his knees. And he could not take his eyes from that dead man, whom hardly an hour before he had buried in the depths of a well, under a shroud of iron and granite. Arsène Lupin's ghost! A man you take aim at, you fire at, you kill. But a ghost! A thing which no longer exists, and which nevertheless disposes of all the supernatural powers. What was the use of struggling against the infernal machinations of that which is no more? What was the use of picking up the fallen revolver and levelling it at the intangible spirit of Arsène Lupin? And he saw an incomprehensible thing occur. The ghost took its hands out of its pockets. One of them held a cigarette case, and the cripple recognized the same gun-metal case for which he had hunted in vain. There was therefore not a doubt left that the creature who had ransacked the jacket was the very same who now opened the case, picked out a cigarette, and struck a match taken from a box which also belonged to the cripple. Oh, miracle! A real flame came from the match. Oh, incomparable marvel! Clouds of smoke rose from the cigarette, real smoke, of which the cripple at once knew the particular smell. He hid his head in his hands. He refused to see more. Whether ghost or optical illusion, an emanation from another world, or an image born of his remorse and proceeding from himself, it should torture his eyes no longer. But he heard the sound of a step approaching him, growing more and more distinct as it came closer. He felt a strange presence moving near him. An arm was stretched out. A hand fell on his shoulder. That hand clutched his flesh with an irresistible grip. And he heard words spoken by a voice which, beyond mistake, was the human and living voice of Arsène Lupin. Why, my dear sir, what a state we're getting ourselves into! Of course, I understand that my sudden return seems an unusual and even an inconvenient proceeding, but still it does not do to be so uncontrollably impressed. Men have seen much more extraordinary things than that, such as Joshua staying the sun, and more sensational disasters, such as the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. The wise man reduces events to their proper proportions, and judges them, not by their action upon his own destiny, but by the way in which they influence the fortunes of the world. Now, confess that your little mishap is purely individual, and does not affect the equilibrium of the solar system. You know what Marcus Aurelius says, on page 84 of Charpentier's edition." The cripple had plucked up courage to raise his head; and the real state of things now became so obviously apparent that he could no longer get away from the undeniable fact. Arsène Lupin was not dead. Arsène Lupin, whom he had hurled into the bowels of the earth and crushed as surely as an insect is crushed with a hammer, Arsène Lupin was not dead. How to explain so astounding a mystery, the cripple did not even stop to wonder. One thing alone mattered: Arsène Lupin was not dead. Arsène Lupin looked and spoke as a living man does. Arsène Lupin was not dead. He breathed, he smiled, he talked, he lived. And it was so certainly life that the scoundrel saw before him that, obeying a sudden impulse of his nature and of his hatred for life, he flattened himself to his full length, reached his revolver, seized it, and fired. He fired, but it was too late. Don Luis had caused the weapon to swerve with a kick of his boot. Another kick sent it flying out of the cripple's hand. The villain ground his teeth with fury, and at once began hurriedly to fumble in his pockets. "Is this what you're looking for, sir?" asked Don Luis, holding up a hypodermic syringe filled with a yellow fluid. "Excuse me, but I was afraid lest you should prick yourself by mistake. That would have been a fatal prick, would it not? And I should never have forgiven myself." The cripple was disarmed. He hesitated for a moment, surprised that the enemy did not attack him more violently, and sought to profit by the delay. His small, blinking eyes wandered around him, looking for something to throw. But an idea seemed to strike him and to restore his confidence little by little; and in a new and really unexpected fit of delight, He indulged in one of his loudest chuckles.
And what about Florence? He shouted. Don't forget Florence, for I've got you there. I can miss you with my revolver, and you can steal my poison, but I have another means of hitting you, right in the heart. You can't live without Florence, can you? Florence's death means your own sentence, doesn't it? If Florence is dead, you'll put the rope round your own neck, won't you? Won't you? Won't you?
Yes, if Florence were to die, I could not survive her.
She is dead,
cried the scoundrel with a renewed burst of merriment, hopping about on his knees.
She's dead, quite dead. What am I saying? She's more than dead. A dead person retains the appearance of a live one for a time, but this is much better. There's no corpse here, Lupin, just a mess of flesh and bone. The whole scaffolding of rocks has come down on top of her. You can picture it, eh? What a sight! Come, quick, it's your turn to kick the bucket. Would you like a length of rope? It's enough to make one die with laughing. Didn't I say that you'd meet at the gates of hell? Quick, your sweetheart's waiting for you. Do you hesitate? Where's your old French politeness? You can't keep a lady waiting, you know. Hurry up, Lupin. Florence is dead.
He said this with real enjoyment, as though the mere word of death appeared to him delicious. Don Luis had not moved a muscle. He simply nodded his head and said, "What a pity." The cripple seemed petrified. All his joyous contortions, all his triumphal pantomime, stopped short. He blurted out,
"Eh? What did you say?"
"I say," declared Don Luis, preserving his calm and courteous demeanour, and refraining from echoing the cripple's familiarity, "I say, my dear sir, that you have done very wrong. I never met a finer nature, nor one more worthy of esteem than that of Mademoiselle Levasseur. The incomparable beauty of her face and figure, her youth, her charm, all these deserved a better treatment. It would indeed be a matter for regret if such a masterpiece of womanhood had ceased to be." The cripple remained astounded. Don Luis's serene manner dismayed him. He said in a blank voice,
"I tell you she has ceased to be. Haven't you seen the grotto? Florence no longer exists."
"I refuse to believe it," said Don Luis quietly. "If that were so, everything would look different. The sky would be clouded, the birds would not be singing, and nature would wear her mourning garb. But the birds are singing, the sky is blue, everything is as it should be. The honest man is alive, and the rascal is crawling at his feet. How could Florence be dead?" A long silence followed upon these words. The two enemies, at 3 paces distance, looked into each other's eyes. Don Luis still as cool as ever, the cripple a prey to the maddest anguish. The monster understood. Obscure as the truth was, it shone forth before him with all the light of a blinding certainty. Florence also was alive. Humanly and physically speaking, the thing was not possible, but the resurrection of Don Luis was likewise an impossibility. And yet Don Luis was alive, with not a scratch on his face, with not a speck of dust on his clothes. The monster felt himself lost. The man who held him in the hollow of his implacable hand was one of those men whose power knows no bounds. He was one of those men who escape from the jaws of death and who triumphantly snatch from death those of whom they have taken charge. The monster retreated, dragging himself slowly backward on his knees along the little brick path. He retreated. He passed by the confused heap of stones that covered the place where the grotto had been, and did not turn his eyes in that direction, as if he were definitely convinced that Florence had come forth safe and sound from the appalling sepulchre. He retreated. Don Luis, who no longer had his eyes fixed on him, was busy unwinding a coil of rope which he had picked up, and seemed to pay no further attention to him. He retreated. And suddenly, after a glance at his enemy, he spun round, drew himself up on his slack legs with an effort, and started running toward the well. He was 20 paces from it. He covered 1/2, 3/4 of the distance. Already the mouth opened before him. He put out his arms, with the movement of a man about to dive, and shot forward. His rush was stopped. He rolled over on the ground, dragged back violently, with his arms fixed so firmly to his body that he was unable to stir. It was Don Luis, who had never wholly lost sight of him, who had made a slip knot to his rope, and who had lassoed the cripple at the moment when he was going to fling himself down the abyss. The cripple struggled for a few moments, but the slip knot bit into his flesh. He ceased moving. Everything was over. End of Chapter 20, Part 1. Chapter 20, Part 2 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 20. Florence's Secret. Then Don Luis Perenna, holding the other end of the lasso, came up to him and bound him hand and foot with what remained of the rope. The operation was carefully performed. Don Luis repeated it time after time, using the coils of rope which the cripple had brought to the well, and gagging him with a handkerchief. And while applying himself to his work, he explained with affected politeness: "You see, sir, people always come to grief through excessive self-confidence. They never imagine that their adversaries can have resources which they themselves do not possess. For instance, when you got me to fall into your trap, how could you have supposed, my dear sir, that a man like myself, a man like Arsène Lupin, hanging on the brim of a well, with his arms resting on the brim and his feet against the inner wall, would allow himself to drop down it like the first silly fool that comes along? Look here, you were 15 or 20 yards away, and do you think that I had not the strength to leap out, nor the courage to face the bullets of your revolver, when it was a question of saving Florence Levasseur's life and my own? Why, my poor sir, the tiniest effort would have been enough, believe me. My reason for not making the effort was that I had something better to do, something infinitely better. I will tell you why, that is, if you care to know. Do you? Well, then, at the very first moment, my knees and feet, propped against the inner wall, had smashed in a thick layer of plaster which closed up an old excavation in the well, and this I at once perceived. It was a stroke of luck, wasn't it? And it changed the whole situation. My plan was settled at once. While I went on acting my little part of the gentleman about to tumble down an abyss, putting on the most scared face, the most staring eyes, the most hideous grin, I enlarged that excavation, taking care to throw the chunks of plaster in front of me in such a way that their fall made no noise. When the moment came, at the very second when my swooning features vanished before your eyes, I simply jumped into my retreat, thanks to a rather plucky little wriggle of the loins. I was saved because the retreat was dug out on the side where you were moving, and because, being dark itself, it cast no light. All that I now had to do was to wait. I listened quietly to your threatening speeches. I let the things you flung down the well go past me. And when I thought you had gone back to Florence, I was preparing to leave my refuge, to return to the light of the day, and to fall upon you from behind when—" Don Luis turned the cripple over, as though he were a parcel which he was tying up with string, and continued: "Have you ever been to Tancarville, the old feudal castle in Normandy, on the banks of the Seine? Haven't you? Well, you must know that, outside the ruins of the keep, there is an old well which, like many other wells of the period, possesses the peculiarity of having two openings, one at the top, facing the sky, and the other a little lower down, hollowed out sideways in the wall, and leading to one of the rooms of the keep. At Tancarville, this second opening is nowadays closed with a grating. Here it was walled up with a layer of small stones and plaster, and it was just the recollection of Tancarville that made me stay, all the more as there was no hurry, since you had had the kindness to inform me that Florence would not join me in the next world until 4 o'clock. I therefore inspected my refuge, and soon realized that, as I had already felt by intuition, it was the foundation of a building which was now demolished, and which had the garden laid out on its ruins. Well, I went on, groping my way and following the direction which, above ground, would have taken me to the grotto. My presentiments were not deceived. A gleam of daylight made its way at the top of a staircase of which I had struck the bottom step. I went up it and heard the sound of your voice." Don Luis turned the cripple over, and was pretty rough about it. Then he resumed: "I wish to impress upon you, my dear sir, that the upshot would have been exactly similar if I had attacked you directly and from the start in the open air. But, having said this, I confess that chance favoured me to some purpose. It has often failed me in the course of our struggle, but this time I had no cause to complain. I felt myself in such luck that I never doubted for a second that, having found the entrance to the subterranean passage, I should also find the way out. As a matter of fact, I had only to pull gently at the slight obstacle of a few stacked bricks which hid the opening in order to make my exit amid the remains of the castle keep. Guided by the sound of your voice, I slipped through the stones and thus reached the back of the grotto in which Florence lay. Amusing, wasn't it? You can imagine what fun it was to hear you make your little speeches. 'Answer me, yes or no, Florence. A movement of your head will decide your fate.
If it's yes, I shall release you. If it's no, you die. Answer me, Florence. A sign of your head. Is the answer yes or no?"
And the end, above all, was delicious, when you scrambled to the top of the grotto and started roaring from up there.
"It's you who have asked to die, Florence. You asked for it, and you've got it."
Just think what a joke it was. At that moment there was no one in the grotto. Not a soul. With one effort I had drawn Florence toward me and put her under shelter. And all that you were able to crush with your avalanche of rocks was one or two spiders, perhaps, and a few flies dozing on the flagstones. The trick was done, and the farce was nearly finished. Act first, Arsène Lupin saved. Act second, Florence Levasseur saved. Act third and last, the monster vanquished, absolutely and with a vengeance. Don Luis stood up and contemplated his work with a satisfied eye. "You look like a sausage, my son," he cried, yielding at last to his sarcastic nature and his habit of treating his enemies familiarly. "A regular sausage, a bit on the thin side, perhaps, a saveloy for poor people. But there, you don't much care what you look like, I suppose? Besides, you're rather like that at all times. And in any case, you're just the thing for the little display of indoor gymnastics which I have in mind for you. You'll see, it's an idea of my own, a really original idea. Don't be impatient, we shan't be long." He took one of the guns which the cripple had brought to the well, and tied to the middle of the gun the end of a 12 or 15 yards length of rope, fastening the other end to the cords with which the cripple was bound, just behind his back. He next took his captive round the body and held him over the well. "Shut your eyes if you feel at all giddy, and don't be frightened. I'll be very careful. Ready?" He put the cripple down the yawning hole and next took hold of the rope which he had just fastened. Then, little by little, inch by inch, cautiously, so that it should not knock against the sides of the well, the bundle was let down at arm's length. When it reached a depth of 12 yards or so, the gun stopped its further descent, and there it remained, slung in the dark and in the exact centre of the narrow circumference. Don Luis set light to a number of pieces of paper which went whirling down, shedding their sinister gleams upon the walls. Then, unable to resist the craving for a last speech, he leaned over, as the scoundrel had done, and grinned. "I selected the place with care, so that you shouldn't catch cold. I'm bound to look after you, you see. I promised Florence that I wouldn't kill you. And I promised the French government to hand you over alive as soon as possible. Only, as I didn't know what to do with you until tomorrow morning, I've hung you up in the air. It's a pretty trick, isn't it? And you ought to appreciate it, for it's so like your own way of doing things. Just think, the gun is resting on its two ends, with hardly an inch to spare. So if you start wriggling or moving, or even breathing too hard, either the barrel or the butt end will give way, and down you go. As for me, I've nothing to do with it. If you die, it'll be a pretty little case of suicide. All you've got to do, old chap, is to keep quiet. And the beauty of my little contrivance is that it will give you a foretaste of the few nights that will precede your last hour, when they cut off your head. From this moment forward, you are alone with your conscience, face to face with what you perhaps call your soul, without anything to disturb your silent soliloquy. It's nice and thoughtful of me, isn't it? Well, I'll leave you. And remember, not a movement, not a sigh, not a wink, not a throb of the heart. And above all, no larks. If you start larking, you're in the soup. Meditate. That's the best thing you can do. Meditate and wait. Goodbye for the present." And Don Luis, satisfied with his homily, went off muttering, "That's all right. I won't go so far as Eugène Sue, who says that great criminals should have their eyes put out. But all the same, a little corporal punishment, nicely seasoned with fear, is right and proper and good for the health and morals." Don Luis walked away, and taking the brick path round the ruins, turned down a little road, which ran along the outer wall to a clump of fir trees, where he had brought Florence for shelter. She was waiting for him, still aching from the horrible suffering which she had endured, but already in full possession of her pluck, mistress of herself, and apparently rid of all anxiety as to the issue of the fight between Don Luis and the cripple. "It's finished," he said simply. "Tomorrow I will hand him over to the police." She shuddered, but she did not speak, and he observed her in silence. It was the first time that they were alone together since they had been separated by so many tragedies, and next hurled against each other like sworn enemies. Don Luis was so greatly excited that, in the end, he could utter only insignificant sentences, having no connection with the thoughts that came rushing through his mind. "We shall find the motor car if we follow this wall and then strike off to the left. Do you think you can manage to walk so far? When we're in the car, we'll go to Alençon. There's a quiet hotel close to the chief square. You can wait there until things take a more favourable turn for you, and that won't be long, as the criminal is caught." "Let's go," she said. He dared not offer to help her. For that matter, she stepped out firmly, and her graceful body swung from her hips with the same even rhythm as usual. Don Luis once again felt all his old admiration and all his ardent love for her. And yet that had never seemed more remote than at this moment when he had saved her life by untold miracles of energy. She had not vouchsafed him a word of thanks, nor yet one of those milder glances which reward an effort made. And she remained the same as on the first day, the mysterious creature whose secret soul he had never understood, and upon whom not even the storm of terrible events had cast the faintest light. What were her thoughts? What were her wishes? What aim was she pursuing? These were obscure problems which he could no longer hope to solve. Henceforth each of them must go his own way in life, and each of them could only remember the other with feelings of anger and spite. "No," he said to himself as she took her place in the limousine. "No, the separation shall not take place like that. The words that have to be spoken between us shall be spoken, and whether she wishes or not, I will tear the veil that hides her." The journey did not take long. At Alençon, Don Luis entered Florence in the visitor's book under the first name that occurred to him, and left her to herself. An hour later he came and knocked at her door. This time again he had not the courage at once to ask her the question which he had made up his mind to put to her. Besides, there were other points which he wished to clear up. "Florence," he said, "before I hand over that man, I should like to know what he was to you." "A friend, an unhappy friend, for whom I felt pity," she declared. "I find it difficult to day to understand my compassion for such a monster, but some years ago, when I first met him, I became attached to him because of his wretchedness, his physical weakness, and all the symptoms of death which he bore upon him even then. He had the opportunity of doing me a few services, and though he led a hidden life, which worried me in certain respects, he gradually, and without my knowing it, acquired a considerable influence over me. I believed in his insight, in his will, in his absolute devotion, and when the Mornington case started, it was he, as I now realize, who guided my actions, and later, those of Gaston Sauverand. It was he who compelled me to practice lying and deceit, persuading me that he was working for Marie Fauville's safety. It was he who inspired us with such suspicion of yourself, and who taught us to be so silent, where he and his affairs were concerned, that Gaston Sauverand did not even dare mention him in his interview with you. I don't know how I can have been so blind, but it was so. Nothing opened my eyes, nothing made me suspect for a moment that harmless ailing creature, who spent half his life in hospitals or nursing homes, who underwent every possible sort of operation, and who, if he did sometimes speak to me of his love, must have known that he could not hope to—" Florence did not finish her sentence. Her eyes had encountered Don Luis's eyes, and she received a deep impression that he was not listening to what she said. He was looking at her, and that was all. The words she uttered passed unheard. To Don Luis any explanation concerning the tragedy itself mattered nothing, so long as he was not enlightened on the one point that interested him, on Florence's private thoughts about himself, thoughts of aversion, of contempt. Outside that, anything that she could say was vain and tedious. He went up to her and, in a low voice, said: "Florence, you know what I feel for you, do you not?" She blushed, taken aback, as though the question was the very last that she expected to hear. Nevertheless, she did not lower her eyes, and she answered frankly: "Yes, I know." "But perhaps," he continued more eagerly, "you do not know how deeply I feel it. Perhaps you do not know that my life has no other aim but you." "I know that also," she said. "Then, if you know it," he said, "I must conclude that it was just that which caused your hostility to me. From the beginning I tried to be your friend, and I tried only to defend you. And yet from the beginning I felt that for you I was the object of an aversion that was both instinctive and deliberate. Never did I see in your eyes anything but coldness, dislike, contempt, and even repulsion. At moments of danger, when your life or your liberty was at stake, you risked committing any imprudence rather than accept my assistance. I was the enemy, the man to be distrusted, the man capable of every infamy, the man to be avoided and to be thought of only with a sort of dread. Isn't that hatred? Is there anything but hatred to explain such an attitude?" Florence did not answer at once. She seemed to be putting off the moment at which to speak the words that rose to her lips. Her face, thin and drawn with weariness and pain, was gentler than usual. "Yes," she said. There are other things than hatred to explain that attitude." Don Luis was dumbfounded. He did not quite understand the meaning of the reply. But Florence's tone of voice disconcerted him beyond measure, and he also saw that Florence's eyes no longer wore their usual scornful expression, and that they were filled with smiling charm. And it was the first time that Florence had smiled in his presence. "Speak, speak, I entreat you," he stammered. "I mean to say that there is another feeling which explains coldness, mistrust, fear, and hostility. It is not always those whom we detest that we avoid with the greatest fear. And if we avoid them, it is often because we are afraid of ourselves, because we are ashamed, because we rebel and want to resist and want to forget and cannot." She stopped, and when he wildly stretched out his arms to her, as if beseeching her to say more and still more, she nodded her head, thus telling him that she need not go on speaking for him to read to the very bottom of her soul and discover the secret of love which she kept hidden there. Don Luis staggered on his feet. He was intoxicated with happiness, almost suffered physical pain from that unexpected happiness. After the horrible minutes through which he had passed amid the impressive surroundings of the old castle, it appeared to him madness to admit that such extraordinary bliss could suddenly blossom forth in the commonplace setting of that room at a hotel. He could have longed for space around him, forest, mountains, moonlight, a radiant sunset, all the beauty and all the poetry of the earth. With one rush he had reached the very acme of happiness. Florence's very life came before him, from the instant of their meeting to the tragic moment when the cripple, bending over her and seeing her eyes filled with tears, had shouted:
She's crying, she's crying. What madness! But I know your secret, Florence, and you're crying. Florence, Florence, you yourself want to die."
It was a secret of love, a passionate impulse which from the first day had driven her all trembling toward Don Luis. Then it had bewildered her, filled her with fear, appeared to her as a betrayal of Marie and Sauverand, and by turns urging her toward and drawing her away from the man whom she loved and whom she admired for his heroism and loyalty, rending her with remorse and overwhelming her as though it were a crime, had ended by delivering her, feeble and disabled, to the diabolical influence of the villain who coveted her. Don Luis did not know what to do, did not know in what words to express his rapture. His lips trembled, his eyes filled with tears. His nature prompted him to take her in his arms, to kiss her as a child kisses, full on the lips, with a full heart. But a feeling of intense respect paralyzed his yearning, and, overcome with emotion, he fell at Florence's feet, stammering words of love and adoration. Chapter 21 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 21. Lupin's Lupins. Next morning, a little before 8 o'clock, Valenglay was talking in his own flat to the Prefect of Police and asked: "So you think as I do, my dear Prefect, he'll come?" "I haven't the least doubt of it, Monsieur le Président. And he will come with the same punctuality that has been shown throughout this business. He will come, for pride's sake, at the last stroke of 8. "You think so?" "Monsieur le Président, I have been studying the man for months. As things now stand, with Florence Levasseur's life in the balance, if he has not smashed the villain whom he is hunting down, if he does not bring him back bound hand and foot, it will mean that Florence Levasseur is dead and that he, Arsène Lupin, is dead." "Whereas Lupin is immortal," said Valenglay, laughing. "You're right. Besides, I agree with you entirely. No one would be more astonished than I if our good friend was not here to the minute. You say you were rung up from Angers yesterday?" "Yes, Monsieur le Président. My men had just seen Don Luis Perenna. He had gone in front of them in an aeroplane. After that they telephoned to me again from Le Mans, where they had been searching a deserted coach house. You may be sure that the search had already been made by Lupin, and that we shall know the results. Listen, 8 o'clock." At the same moment they heard the throbbing of a motor car. It stopped outside the house, and the bell rang almost immediately after. Orders had been given beforehand. The door opened, and Don Luis Perenna was shown in. To Valenglay and the Prefect of Police his arrival was certainly not unexpected, for they had just been saying that they would have been surprised if he had not come. Nevertheless, their attitude showed that astonishment which we all experience in the face of events that seem to pass the bounds of human possibility. "Well?" cried the Prime Minister eagerly. "It's done, Monsieur le Président." "Have you collared the scoundrel?" "Yes." "By Jove!" said Valenglay, "you're a fine fellow." And he went on to ask, "An ogre, of course, an evil, undaunted brute?" "No, Monsieur le Président, a cripple, a degenerate, responsible for his actions, certainly, but a man in whom the doctors will find every form of wasting illness: disease of the spinal cord, tuberculosis, and all the rest of it." "And is that the man whom Florence Levasseur loved?" "Monsieur le Président!" Don Luis violently protested. "Florence never loved that wretch. She felt sorry for him, as any one would do for a fellow creature doomed to an early death. And it was out of pity that she allowed him to hope that she might marry him later, at some time in the vague future." "Are you sure of that?" "Yes, Monsieur le Président, of that and of a good deal more besides, for I have the proofs in my hands." Without further preamble, he continued: "Monsieur le Président, now that the man is caught, it will be easy for the police to find out every detail of his life. But meanwhile I can sum up that monstrous life for you, looking only at the criminal side of it and passing briefly over 3 murders which have nothing to do with the story of the Mornington case. Jean Vernocq was born at Alençon and brought up at old M. Langernault's expense. He got to know the de Dessus-la-Mer couple, robbed them of their money, and, before they had time to lodge a complaint against the unknown thief, took them to a barn in the village of Damigny, where, in their despair, stupefied and besotted with drugs, they hanged themselves. This barn stood in a property called the Old Castle, belonging to M. Langernault, Jean Vernocq's protector, who was ill at the time. After his recovery, as he was cleaning his gun, he received a full charge of shot in the abdomen. The gun had been loaded without the old fellow's knowledge. By whom? By Jean Vernocq, who had also emptied his patron's cash box the night before. In Paris, where he went to enjoy the little fortune which he had thus amassed, Jean Vernocq bought from some rogue of his acquaintance papers containing evidence of Florence Levasseur's birth and of her right to all the inheritance of the Roussel family and Victor Sauverand, papers which the friend in question had purloined from the old nurse who brought Florence over from America. By hunting around, Jean Vernocq ended by discovering, first, a photograph of Florence, and then Florence herself. He made himself useful to her and pretended to be devoted to her, giving up his whole life to her service. At that time he did not yet know what profit he could derive from the papers stolen from the girl or from his relations with her. Suddenly everything became different. An indiscreet word let fall by a solicitor's clerk told him of a will in Maître Lepertuis's drawer which would be interesting to look at. He obtained a sight of it by bribing the clerk, who has since disappeared, with a 1,000-franc note. The will, as it happened, was Cosmo Mornington's; and in it Cosmo Mornington bequeathed his immense wealth to the heirs of the Roussel sisters and of Victor Sauverand. Jean Vernocq saw his chance: 100,000,000 francs, to get hold of that sum, to obtain riches, luxury, power, and the means of buying health and strength from the world's great healers. All that he had to do was first to put away the different persons who stood between the inheritance and Florence, and then, when all the obstacles were overcome, to make Florence his wife. Jean Vernocq went to work. He had found among the papers of Hippolyte Fauville's old friend Langernault particulars relating to the Roussel family and to the discord that reigned in the Fauville household. 5 persons, all told, were in his way: first, of course, Cosmo Mornington; next, in the order of their claims, Hippolyte Fauville, his son Edmond, his wife Marie, and his cousin Gaston Sauverand. With Cosmo Mornington the thing was easy enough. Introducing himself to the American as a doctor, Jean Vernocq put poison into one of the phials which Mornington used for his hypodermic injections. But in the case of Hippolyte Fauville, whose goodwill he had secured through his acquaintance with old Langernault, and over whose mind he soon obtained an extraordinary influence, he had a greater difficulty to contend with. Knowing, on the one hand, that the engineer hated his wife, and on the other that he was stricken with a fatal disease, he took occasion, after the consultation with the specialist in London, to suggest to Fauville's terrified brain the incredible plan of suicide, of which you were subsequently able to trace the Machiavellian execution. In this way, and with a single effort, anonymously, so to speak, and without appearing in the business, without Fauville's even suspecting the action brought to bear upon him, Jean Vernocq procured the deaths of Fauville and his son, and got rid of Marie and Sauverand by the devilish expedient of causing the charge of murder, of which no one could accuse him, to fall upon them. The plan succeeded. There was only one hitch at the present time: the intervention of Inspector Vérot. Inspector Vérot died. And there was only one danger in the future: the intervention of myself, Don Luis Perenna, whose conduct Vernocq was bound to foresee, as I was the residuary legatee by the terms of Cosmo Mornington's will. This danger Vernoc tried to avert first by giving me the house on the Place du Palais Bourbon to live in, and Florence Levasseur as a secretary, and next by making 4 attempts to have me assassinated by Gaston Sauverand. He therefore held all the threads of the tragedy in his hands. Able to come and go as he pleased in my house, enforcing himself upon Florence and later upon Gaston Sauverand by the strength of his will and the cunning of his character, he was within sight of the goal. When my efforts succeeded in proving the innocence of Marie Fauville and Gaston Sauverand, he did not hesitate. Marie Fauville died. Gaston Sauverand died. So everything was going well for him. The police pursued me. The police pursued Florence. No one suspected him. And the date fixed for the payment of the inheritance was at hand. This was 2 days ago. At that time, Jean Vernoc was in the midst of the fray. He was ill and had obtained admission to the nursing home in the Avenue des Ternes. From there he conducted his operations, thanks to his influence over Florence Levasseur and to the letters addressed to the Mother Superior from Versailles. Acting under the Superior's orders, and ignorant of the meaning of the step which she was taking, Florence went to the meeting at the Prefect's office, and herself brought the documents relating to her. Meanwhile Jean Vernoc left the private hospital and took refuge near the Ile Saint-Louis, where he awaited the result of an enterprise which, at the worst, might tell against Florence, but which did not seem able to compromise him in any case. "You know the rest, Monsieur le Président," said Don Luis, concluding his statement. Florence, staggered by the sudden revelation of the part which she had unconsciously taken in the matter, and especially by the terrible part played by Jean Vernoc, ran away from the nursing home where the Prefect had brought her at my request. She had but one thought: to see Jean Vernoc, demand an explanation of him, and hear what he had to say in his defence. That same evening he carried her away by motor, on the pretence of giving her proofs of his innocence. That is all, Monsieur le Président." Valenglay had listened with growing interest to this gruesome story of the most malevolent genius conceivable to the mind of man. And he heard it perhaps without too great disgust, because of the light which it threw by contrast upon the bright, easy, happy, and spontaneous genius of the man who had fought for the good cause. "And you found them?" he asked. "At 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, Monsieur le Président. It was time. I might even say that it was too late, for Jean Vernoc began by sending me to the bottom of a well, and by crushing Florence under a block of stone." "Oh, so you're dead, are you?" "Yes, Monsieur le Président." "But why did that villain want to do away with Florence Levasseur? Her death destroyed his indispensable scheme of matrimony." "It takes 2 to get married, Monsieur le Président, and Florence refused." "Well?" "Some time ago, Jean Vernoc wrote a letter leaving all that he possessed to Florence Levasseur. Florence, moved by pity for him, and not realizing the importance of what she was doing, wrote a similar letter, leaving her property to him. This letter constitutes a genuine and indisputable will in favour of Jean Vernoc. As Florence was Cosmo Mornington's legal and settled heiress by the mere fact of her presence at yesterday's meeting, with the documents proving her descent from the Roussel family, her death caused her rights to pass to her own legal and settled heir. Jean Vernoc would have come into the money without the possibility of any litigation, and as you would have been obliged to discharge him after his arrest, for lack of evidence against him, he would have led a quiet life, with 14 murders on his conscience I have added them up but with 100 million francs in his pocket. To a monster of his stamp, the one made up for the other." "But do you possess all the proofs?" asked Valenglay eagerly. "Here they are," said Perenna, producing the pocketbook which he had taken out of the cripple's jacket. "Here are letters and documents which the villain preserved, owing to a mental aberration common to all great criminals. Here, by good luck, is his correspondence with Hippolyte Fauville. Here is the original of the prospectus from which I learned that the house on the Place du Palais Bourbon was for sale. Here is a memorandum of Jean Vernoc's journeys to Alençon to intercept Fauville's letters to old Langernault. Here is another memorandum showing that Inspector Vérot overheard a conversation between Fauville and his accomplice, that he shadowed Vernoc and robbed him of Florence Levasseur's photograph, and that Vernoc sent Fauville in pursuit of him. Here is a third memorandum, which is just a copy of the 2 found in the 8th volume of Shakespeare, and which proves that Jean Vernoc, to whom that set of Shakespeare belonged, knew all about Fauville's machination. Here are his correspondence with Caceres, the Peruvian attaché, and the letters denouncing myself and Sergeant Mazeroux, which he intended to send to the press. Here... But need I say more, Monsieur le Président? You have the complete evidence in your hands. The magistrates will find that all the accusations which I made yesterday before the Prefect of Police were strictly true." "And he?" cried Valenglay. "The criminal? Where is he?" "Outside, in a motor car, in his motor car, rather." "Have you told my men?" asked M. Desmalions anxiously. "Yes, Monsieur le Préfet. Besides, the fellow is carefully tied up. Don't be alarmed. He won't escape." "Well, you've foreseen every contingency," said Valenglay, "and the business seems to me to be finished. But there's one problem that remains unexplained, the one perhaps that interested the public most. I mean the marks of the teeth in the apple, the teeth of the tiger, as they have been called, which were certainly Mme. Fauville's teeth, innocent though she was. Monsieur le Préfet declares that you have solved this problem." "Yes, Monsieur le Président, and Jean Vernocq's papers prove that I was right. Besides, the problem is quite simple. The apple was marked with Mme. Fauville's teeth, but Mme. Fauville never bit the apple." Come. Monsieur le Président, Hippolyte Fauville very nearly said as much when he mentioned this mystery in his posthumous confession." "Hippolyte Fauville was a madman." "Yes, but a lucid madman, and capable of reasoning with the most appalling logic. Some years ago, at Palermo, Mme. Fauville had a very bad fall, hitting her mouth against the marble top of a table, with the result that a number of her teeth, in both the upper and the lower jaw, were loosened. To repair the damage, and to make the gold plate intended to strengthen the teeth, a plate which Mme. Fauville wore for several months, the dentist, as usual, took an impression of her mouth. M. Fauville happened to have kept the mould, and he used it to print the marks of his wife's teeth in the cake of chocolate shortly before his death, and in the apple on the night of his death. When this was done, he put the mould with the other things which the explosion was meant to, and did, destroy." Don Luis's explanation was followed by a silence. The thing was so simple that the Prime Minister was quite astonished. The whole tragedy, the whole charge, everything that had caused Marie's despair and death, and the death of Gaston Sauverand, all this rested on an infinitely small detail which had occurred to none of the millions and millions of people who had interested themselves so enthusiastically in the mystery of the teeth of the tiger. The teeth of the tiger! Everybody had clung stubbornly to an apparently invincible argument. As the marks on the apple and the print of Mme. Fauville's teeth were identical, as no two persons in the world were able, in theory or practice, to produce the same print with their teeth, Mme. Fauville must needs be guilty. Nay, more, the argument seemed so absolute that, from the day on which Mme. Fauville's innocence became known, the problem had remained unsolved, while no one seemed capable of conceiving the one paltry idea, that it was possible to obtain the print of a tooth in another way than by a live bite of that same tooth. "It's like the egg of Columbus," said Valenglay, laughing. "It had to be thought of." "You are right, Monsieur le Président. People don't think of those things. Here is another instance. May I remind you that during the period when Arsène Lupin was known at the same time as M. Lenormand and as Prince Paul Sernine, no one noticed that the name Paul Sernine was merely an anagram of Arsène Lupin? Well, it's just the same today. Luis Perenna also is an anagram of Arsène Lupin. The two names are composed of the same 11 letters, neither more nor less. And yet, although it was the second time, nobody thought of making that little comparison. The egg of Columbus again. It had to be thought of." Valenglay was a little surprised at the revelation. It seemed as if that devil of a man had sworn to puzzle him up to the last moment, and to bewilder him by the most unexpected sensational news. And how well this last detail depicted the fellow, a queer mixture of dignity and impudence, of mischief and simplicity, of smiling chaff and disconcerting charm, a sort of hero who, while conquering kingdoms by most incredible adventures, amused himself by mixing up the letters on his name so as to catch the public napping. The interview was nearly at an end. Valenglay said to Perenna: "Monsieur, you have done wonders in this business, and ended by keeping your word and handing over the criminal. I also will keep my word. You are free." "I thank you, Monsieur le Président. But what about Sergeant Mazeroux?" "He will be released this morning. Monsieur le Préfet de Police has arranged matters so that the public do not know of the arrest of either of you. You are Don Luis Perenna. There is no reason why you should not remain Don Luis Perenna." "And Florence Levasseur, Monsieur le Président?" "Let her go before the examining magistrate of her own accord. He is bound to discharge her. Once free and acquitted of any charge or even suspicion, she will certainly be recognized as Cosmo Mornington's legal heiress, and will receive the 100 millions." "She will not keep it, Monsieur le Président." "How do you mean?" "Florence Levasseur doesn't want the money. It has been the cause of unspeakable, awful crimes. She hates the very thought of it." "What then?" "Cosmo Mornington's 100 millions will be wholly devoted to making roads and building schools in the south of Morocco and the northern Congo." "In the Mauritanian Empire which you are giving us?" said Valenglay, laughing. "By Jove, it's a fine work, and I second it with all my heart. An empire with an imperial budget to keep it up with. Upon my word, Don Luis has behaved well to his country, and has handsomely paid the debts of Arsène Lupin." A month later, Don Luis Perenna and Mazeroux embarked in the yacht which had brought Don Luis to France. Florence was with them. Before sailing, they heard of the death of Jean Vernocq, who had managed to poison himself in spite of all the precautions taken to prevent him. On his arrival in Africa, Don Luis Perenna, Sultan of Mauritania, found his old associates and accredited Mazeroux to them and to his grand dignitaries. He organized the government to follow on his abdication and precede the annexation of the new empire by France, and he had several secret interviews on the Moorish border with General Léauty, commanding the French troops, interviews in the course of which they thought out all the measures to be executed in succession so as to lend to the conquest of Morocco an appearance of facility which would otherwise be difficult to explain. The future was now assured. Soon the thin screen of rebellious tribes standing between the French and the pacified districts would fall to pieces, revealing an orderly empire, provided with a regular constitution, with good roads, schools and courts of law, a flourishing empire in full working order. Then, when his task was done, Don Luis abdicated. He has now been back for over 2 years. Every one remembers the stir caused by his marriage with Florence Levasseur. The controversy was renewed, and many of the newspapers clamoured for Arsène Lupin's arrest. But what could the authorities do? Although nobody doubted who he really was, although the name of Arsène Lupin and the name of Don Luis Perenna consisted of the same letters, and people ended by remarking the coincidence, legally speaking, Arsène Lupin was dead and Don Luis Perenna was alive, and there was no possibility of bringing Arsène Lupin back to life or of killing Don Luis Perenna. He is today living in the village of Saint-Maclou, among those charming valleys which run down to the Oise. Who does not know his modest little pink-washed house, with its green shutters and its garden filled with bright flowers? People make up parties to go there from Paris on Sundays, in a hope of catching a sight through the elder hedges of the man who was Arsène Lupin, or of meeting him in the village square. He is there, with his hair just touched with grey, his still youthful features, and a young man's bearing. And Florence is there, too, with her pretty figure and the halo of fair hair around her happy face, unclouded by even the shadow of an unpleasant recollection. Very often visitors come and knock at the little wooden gate. They are unfortunate people imploring the master's aid, victims of oppression, weaklings who have gone under in the struggle, reckless persons who have been ruined by their passions. For all these Don Luis is full of pity. He gives them his full attention, the help of his far-seeing advice, his experience, his strength, and even his time, disappearing for days and weeks to fight the good fight once more. And sometimes, also, it is an emissary from the Prefect's office or some subordinate of the police who comes to submit a complex case to his judgment. Here again Don Luis applies the whole of his wonderful mind to the business. In addition to this, in addition to his old books on ethics and philosophy, to which he has returned with such pleasure, he cultivates his garden. He dotes on his flowers. He is proud of them. He takes prizes at the shows, and the success is still remembered of the treble carnation, streaked red and yellow, which he exhibited as the Arsène carnation. But he works hardest at certain large flowers that blossom in summer. During July and the first half of August they fill 2/3 of his lawn and all the borders of his kitchen garden. Beautiful, decorative plants, standing erect like flagstaffs, they proudly raise their spiky heads of all colours: blue, violet, mauve, pink, white. They are lupins, and include every variety: Cruikshank's lupin, the 2-coloured lupin, the scented lupin, and the last to appear, Lupin's lupin. They are all there, resplendent, in serried ranks like an army of soldiers, each striving to outstrip the others, and to hold up the thickest and gaudiest spike to the sun. They are all there, and at the entrance to the walk that leads to their motley beds is a streamer with this device, taken from an exquisite sonnet of José Maria de Heredia: "And in my kitchen garden lupins grow." You will say that this is a confession. But why not? In the evening, when a few privileged neighbours meet at his house, the Justice of the Peace, the notary, Major Comte d'Astrignac, who has also gone to live at Saint-Maclou, Don Luis is not afraid to speak of Arsène Lupin. "I used to see a great deal of him," he says. "He was not a bad man. I will not go so far as to compare him with the 7 sages, or even to hold him up as an example to future generations, but still we must judge him with a certain indulgence. He did a vast amount of good and a moderate amount of harm. Those who suffered through him deserved what they got, and fate would have punished them sooner or later if he had not forestalled her. Between a Lupin who selected his victims among the ruck of wicked rich men and some big company promoter who deliberately ruins numbers of poor people, would you hesitate for a moment? Does not Lupin come out best? And on the other hand, what a host of good actions! What countless proofs of disinterested generosity! A burglar? I admit it. A swindler? I don't deny it. He was all that, but he was something more than that; and while he amused the gallery with his skill and ingenuity, he roused the general enthusiasm in other ways. People laughed at his practical jokes, but they loved his pluck, his courage, his adventurous spirit, his contempt for danger, his shrewd insight, his unfailing good humour, his reckless energy: all qualities that stood out at a period when the most active virtues of our race had reached their zenith, the period of the motor car and the aeroplane. "One day," he said as a joke, "I should like my epitaph to read, 'Here lies Arsène Lupin, adventurer.'" That was quite correct. He was a master of adventure. And if the spirit of adventure led him too often to put his hand in other people's pockets, it also led him to battlefields where it gives those who are worthy opportunity to fight and win titles of distinction which are not within reach of all. It was there that he gained his. It is there that you should see him at work, spending his strength braving death and defying destiny. And it is because of this that you must forgive him, even if he did sometimes get the better of a commissary of police or steal the watch of an examining magistrate. Let us show some indulgence to our professors of energy." And nodding his head, Don Luis concludes: "Then, you see, he had another virtue which is not to be despised. It is a virtue for which we should be grateful to him in these grey days of ours. He knew how to smile." Chapter 21. End of The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice Leblanc.